Welcome. This is the first in a series of three recordings of the virtual Basic Soils for Pouts series that was held in February of 2025. The class was led by Matt Jansen, Pouts Plan Reviewer with DSPS, and the goal of this series is to help prepare aspiring soil testers to take their exam and to refresh those that currently hold the credential. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy it.
First of all, I just wanted to go through and show you a little bit about what our planned agenda is for this week and next week. And I'm doing today is going through goals and objectives. So it's a general soils and wastewater discussion, sort of how everything fits together, some background of what we do and why we do it, and a break, and then we're going to continue that discussion. Then after another short break, we're going to get into soil formation, how soils form, and that will cover it for today. That'll take us through till 4 o'clock today. Tomorrow, we're going to look at some physical properties of soil. And after a short break, we're going to talk about performing soil and site evaluations. And then after a break, we will continue that discussion, and that will take us through tomorrow. So this week is pretty much just basically instructional. So it's more of like classroom lecture kind of thing. Next week, though, it's going to be a little bit different. On day 3, so that would be Wednesday next week, we're going to look at soil chemistry and biology. And after a short break, we're going to do our hand texturing. So those of you that did buy the kits, we have 5 samples, A, B, C, D, and E listed in there. And we're going to take those out. I'll have an overhead camera, and we'll be able to, I'll show you how the structure and texture works on those. Should also have some other samples that are known I can show you. You guys won't have them, but show you sort of how the texturing works. And we can practice our colors in that, and you'll be able to do that remotely. If you did not order the sample, you can still see on my camera sort of what I'm doing and follow along. But that'll give you plenty of time to talk about things. We'll also look at some sand, some other particle sizes, some things like that too. And then we'll get in after a break, soil physics, and talk about physical movement of soil and water, those kind of things. And then day 4, we'll have soil classification and survey. And then we're going to actually, instead of being out in the field, which we typically do in the 2-day in-person sessions, we're going to actually do a little bit of practice CST exam. We're going to take a lot of the information that we've learned over the previous 3.5 days and put them together. You'll take sort of like a mini practice CST exam, or even if you have the CST license, you can do a practice knowledge exam, see how well you've retained everything that you know. And then we'll go through question by question, and you'll self-grade. It's not like anything you have to submit or share. You just keep track yourself, and then we'll go through the questions and the answers on your own, or you can self-grade yourself. We'll go through them together. So anyway, that's what's going on for that, and then we will get into um, the basic soils. So again, this class is geared towards the basic soils, the basic soil tester, or the new soil tester person getting the new CST. It's also useful for those that have the license to refresh your memory about what's going on. Cover the basics again. Maybe you weren't trained, or you didn't go to school for this and didn't learn it, but it's good to go through the basics and understand the concepts again. So our objectives that we're trying to do is, again, an understanding of soil science and how it relates to on-site treatment and dispersal of wastewater. So soil science in itself is sort of like a jack of all trades. It's not something that you necessarily go, even if you're going to school for it, that you take a lot of credits in soil science. But as you saw on our agenda, a lot of other things play in. So you need to know some biology, you need to know physics, you need to know chemistry, you need to know math. So there's a lot of other things that fall in with it, and having that sort of holistic approach to soil science and understanding how all those different parts affect soil, that will also help you on the wastewater treatment and the on-site dispersal part of it. So we also want to become familiar with soil morphology. That's important for us, is to um, evaluate soils. We have to do a soil profile, and we have to evaluate that morphology of the soil and describe its physical properties so we can assign loading rates and determine how well that site or that soil will treat wastewater. And then we tie that in with understanding the requirements for performing our soil and site evaluations, and what those Wisconsin rules are, and sort of how understanding the basics of soil morphology ties with what Wisconsin requirements are for the on-site waste. Okay, so a certified soil tester. Um, our goals and objectives for that is, what is the responsibility of this certified soil tester? So that is the person that can go out and do these morphological evaluations, the only one allowed to do that. There are some others that can look at the site or the plot plan and describe that, but the CST is probably going to be the person that does that, because if they're doing the morphological evaluation, they're probably going to gather the site data at the same time. And so we want to go through and explain a little bit about what's on the exam, what are the laws and codes required, how we disperse, stuff, how we treat wastewater, a little bit of history of what's going on, and sort of the concepts about, not only treatment but vertical separation credit, limiting factors, things like that. As we mentioned, soil formation, physical properties. The topics we're going to cover is what is soil, how does soil form. There's some soil forming factors, understanding parent materials and how key that is to understanding what a parent material is and how that imparts characteristics on the soil, and then what those characteristics are of the soil itself. And then, as I'd mentioned before, soil and site evaluations. How do you go about that as a certified soil tester? How do you approach a site? Where do you look? What's good areas? What's bad areas? What are some clues that you can use? Um, to find a spot other than the homeowner says this is where I want it. Give you some clues about what's a good location, what's a bad location. And then once you do that evaluation, how to establish loading rates, size the system. Even though you're not a designer, as part of it being a CST, you need to have some basic concepts of how systems are designed, what the different kinds of systems are, so that you're testing the right area or the best area, so to speak, and that you're also testing enough of an area. If you test too small of an area, the system needs to be larger, then you're going to have to come back out there, and you're not going to make friends with the homeowner or the plumber if you're having to make repeated trips out there to get it right. Also want to talk about concepts of legal descriptions, contour lines, elevations, and site plans. So some other things that tie in with the siting evaluation, or drawing up a plot plan. And then, as I mentioned, chemistry, biology in our agenda. We'll be looking at some of those kind of things. Chemistry and biology is sort of self-explanatory. Chemistry of the properties in soil, how and why redoxymorphic features form. That's a chemical reaction. So we'll get into some of that. And then soil physics. Mostly it's water movement in soil, but it also deals with just the physical properties of soil itself. And that ties in with things like interpretive determinations and other physical impacts on soil, things that could happen. And then the last section, as I mentioned in the agenda, classification taxonomy. We're not going to get too heavy or deep into it, but we're going to talk some for those of you that have been on our pout chats and have seen Katie's been talking about the different soil orders. That's exactly what we're going to talk about, is what some of the soil orders are, classification, soil series, how things are classified, just like we're in the animal kingdom, but we're primates. We're mammals, as humans. Same thing, as the soils are classified accordingly to different, groups and subgroups, and talk about how those fit in, how to identify them. But also, most importantly, when you're reading printed soil survey or the web soil survey, that you can identify some of these soils by their classification or by their series name. And you'll know that if somebody says you're on a Anago silt loam or a plainfield sand, you'll know what you'll most likely be facing before you get out there. And then the field session, obviously we won't be doing that because we'll be here in the classroom. But if you do one of our sessions throughout the year, if you another 2 day session is going to be exactly what you're seeing here, just a field session component. Hopefully this summer we'll have some field sessions just solo by itself. We're hoping to string together a couple of those where it's just going to be get out in the field and actually be able to practice, or practice on a pit, and look at some areas. So hopefully we'll be able to do that and get you out there where it's not just a virtual learning. So I want to point out a couple things, and we'll be mentioning these throughout. I know Katie did send with this invite to the session. I believe the soil and site evaluation handbook. Um, so that's very helpful. Everything that we're going to talk about here is pretty much in the soil and site handbook. It's a good reference for you, even if you're, to refer back at any time or to do a refresher. Or to help study for the CST exam. Everything you need to know is pretty much in there or in the code. So you can, well, you got an online version. Otherwise, you can order a version from um, we have a printing office that prints stuff out. But again, if you have it free and you don't need a physical copy, or if you do, print it out yourself or go to Office Max or something and have them do it, it's probably going to be cheaper. And then we also have a Pouts Inspector Handbook, and you can get that also off our website if you go into the Pouts section. That's more detailed into what the Pouts inspectors have to do, but another great reference. And even if you're not doing that or not designing, sometimes it's good to just be familiar with what's involved in inspecting a system and knowing what's going on. And then at the bottom, we do have a couple other reference soil survey manuals online through the USDA. You don't need the full, you can screenshot it, I guess, there. Otherwise, if you just search for it, soil survey manual, NRCS, you should be able to find a link to it. And then they also have a companion book, field book for describing and sampling soils. So survey manual basically is the same information as soil and site evaluation handbook. We're going to learn here basically how to the language and the abbreviations and stuff. And a field book for describing and sampling soils is a little more geared towards the NRCS field people, but it's another good reference, gets a little bit more detailed. And then at the bottom, once you start doing soil tests, you also need a Munsell color book to do the colors. And some suppliers there, forestry suppliers, Amazon, eBay is where we're seeing most of the people are finding them. But again, like Katie said, if you have any questions, you can jump in here if when I pause my speaking here. Otherwise, if you want to just put it in the chat, Katie will be monitoring that, and then you can or she'll jump in and ask the question for you. But it's all part of learning, so don't be afraid to jump in here and do that. We've got a small enough group; we should be able to handle any interruptions like that. So I want to talk about when we're out there doing the on-site or doing the soil profile kind of thing. It's important um, to know that on-site systems are they're soil based, and that soil evaluation is a very important part of that. Is that if we're putting a mound or an in-ground conventional out on the site, we have to know what the characteristics of the soil are and how that soil operates in order to get that system to work correctly. So it's important to be accurate with your description and understand what's going on with that septic system or how the septic system is supposed to operate. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to provide a good soil and site evaluation. And if we don't do a good job at that, that's our groundwork for the designer or the installer that's designing it, the master plumber, to come by. They're going to use your work as a soil tester as a basis for them to build off of. So just like a house with a foundation, if the foundation is bad, it doesn't matter how good the builder is or how good the cabinet maker is or anybody else or how good the carpet layer is. If the foundation is faulty, everything is being undermined. So the soil tester needs to understand what's going to happen after they're there, just like a builder putting a foundation is going to have to understand what they're building on top or how everything's going to go. Otherwise, you're already on faulty footing. The installers also need to be familiar with soils to understand potential problems that they encounter. So sometime there may have been, maybe there's an error or an oversight or something, or possibly negligence, hopefully not. But if the soil tester missed something or did not see something out on the site, it's up to the installer to hopefully catch that. We've had some sites where installers didn't know the soils, start installing a system and oblivious to the fact that things were missed. We've had other cases where the installer says, I'm out there and I start digging and I see something that doesn't look right. They put a stop to it and say, let's get this fixed before we continue on putting a system in that's going to be a problem down the road because some site conditions were missed. Not to say, like I said, that soil testers necessarily negligent or something. It's just things happen. So it doesn't hurt to have that little bit of knowledge also. So what are we trying to do? What are we trying to really accomplish out there? Well, obviously we're trying to get a soil test to get a system in, but ultimately we're here to protect the health of the public, and that's where these rules came from. So, back in 1914, that was our sort of our first rules at the plumbing code, and it was driven by public health. The plumbing code wasn't a building code; it was a public health code. And we're trying to basically take that water, get it back into the environment, recycle that without, you know, causing pollution. We want to make sure that we protect water supplies, also surface water, not just drinking water, but surface water, groundwater. And then we don't want to have any health problems. We don't want to have disease or something else that's going to cause us an issue. We don't want people to get sick by drinking water or coming in contact with surface water. So that's why we do what we do, and why that soil test or the soil tester is so important. So here's some code sections: SPS 383.01. Um, the purpose of the chapter is to establish uniform standards. So there's actually two codes that we deal with. 383 deals more with septic system design and parameters surrounding that, and that is a uniform standard. So basically, whether you're in Racine or Bayfield County, it's going to be applied, pretty much uniform. But there are a couple exceptions in there. We allow the counties to be more restrictive if they so choose, but 90, I guess 8% of it is uniform across the state. So that deals with the on-site wastewater systems, to make sure that we're doing something uniform, we're designing them correctly. And then we have 385, which deals with the soil portion of it. So 385 is dealing with how we do a soil evaluation, some of the other parameters in it, and talking about special reports and things like that. So 385 is the soil testing code. 383 is the POUTS, or the design code, so to speak. So how do we put this all together? Um, well, hopefully, if we do a satisfactory soil and site evaluation, that's our goal. And then we take that soil and site evaluation and we design a system, a POUTS, that will fit the soil and site conditions. And then once we have a design, then we get the review of that and we get a permit. Hopefully that all meets code requirements. And then we have somebody put that system in. And then we have the county come by and take a look at it to make sure that everything was done correctly. So that's sort of the process of where we go. And as I said, before we can get to inspection or installation or permits and review or designs, the first thing we need to do is we need to do that soil and site evaluation. And again, that's why it's so important that everything else builds off of that soil and site evaluation. And if we did something wrong or missed something, we don't want to be on step 5 of the inspection and find out there, because now that's been a lot of time, money, and effort that's been wasted. Then we're going to have to go back to square one and start over. And then, okay, and then we have another one: manage the pouts to make sure that we're doing it correctly down the road. How does this all work? Many of you are familiar with that, but it doesn't hurt to go back through and talk about these kind of things. Is, how does the septic system work? Here's a conventional septic, and we have our house on the left, and we have our building sewer that comes out of the house, enters into our septic tank, where we have the solids settled. The grease and fats and oils float to the top. We have a clear zone that there's some minor digestion that occurs, anaerobic digestion in the tank, low oxygen, and it's a slow process, but it will break down some, and then it flows out of that septic tank. Here they show a distribution box, but it may just flow directly into your drain field, and then that clear zone gets final treatment out in that drain field and through the soil, so it filters down through that soil before it would enter a zone of saturation, either groundwater or perched water table or bedrock, and that 3 foot separation of what's code required, and that's in there to do that final treatment, make sure we remove viruses and pathogens, and clean up that water before it get someplace that, once it enters groundwater or zone of saturation, we're not getting treatment anymore. So that's the basics of how, um, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the science about why it works that way in the soil, but that's generally what's going on. And so, ultimately, we're recycling our wastewater. The whole goal of this is, we pull stuff out of a well and we're using it on site right back in the drain field and dispersing it to the groundwater. Um, and that's where it goes. So you're probably seeing something like this, water cycle, in a textbook or something, or been explained. Um, you know, condensation goes up or evaporation goes up into a cloud. It rains, precipitates back down, goes back into groundwater into the river, evaporates up again, and then goes around, and that's the water cycle. So we're just a part of that. And the nice part about the on-site waste is that if we're pulling stuff out of a well and we're putting it back in, we're putting it in locally. So where I'm at here up in Wausau, if we turn on a water tap and we pull water out of the local aquifer through our well, and by turning on that water tap, I use it. I send it, whether I'm washing my hands or brushing my teeth, I send that water down the drain. And where's that water end up? The water ends up in the Gulf of Mexico because that water goes from here, goes through the pipes, ends up in the sewer treatment plant. The sewer treatment plant treats it, and it gets discharged to the Wisconsin River. And the Wisconsin River flows to the Mississippi. Mississippi flows to the Gulf of Mexico. So every time I turn on my tap here in the city of Wausau, water is not being returned back to the environment here. It's going to the Gulf of Mexico. So that's one of the nice things about pout systems, or pouts, that they they're basically a local water recycling. Is that we're recycling the water here on site. We're not sending it down the big pipe and transporting it to Gulf of Mexico. So something to be aware of. But then also on the other hand, we have to make sure that we do a good job of it because we don't want it to get back, short circuit, not be treated, get back into groundwater, get back into our well or into our local lake or stream, and then cause a problem. So, what are some common diseases related to untreated sewage? Here's a list of them. You can see you got pathogenic bacterias, typhoid fever, gastroenteritis, cholera, dysentery. We got some helminths, gastroenteritis again, just as sort of a generic term for stomach bugs, chronic anemia, infectious viruses, polio, hepatitis, meningitis, encephalitis, not great things. Protozoa, Giardia in there. That was the big issue that we had in Milwaukee back in the early 90s, where they had their sewage discharge or overflow for stormwater surge was less than a mile from the water uptake for the city of Milwaukee. So they had a big rainstorm and a bypass. Raw sewage was discharged out into Lake Michigan, made its way across the lake bed and got pulled up by their water inlet. And normally that would not have been a problem, except um, their UV, or I think it was chlorination maybe at that time, wasn't working and didn't kill them off and got a lot of people sick. Um, and it may be dysentery. So if you know of anybody that's had Giardia or had some problems with that, um, it's not fun. Also, if you look back years ago, what people died from, it was stuff on this page. People died from cholera, typhoid, polio, meningitis, hepatitis. That's what people died from. Um, People now, it's heart disease or car accident or cancer, things like that. Um, Back then, around 1900, this is what people died from. And so, with our rules and our plumbing codes to address these kind of things, and hopefully do a better job at treating our sewage and dealing with it, people are not dying from these kind of things in the numbers that they used to. Also, besides getting rid of the bad critters, so to speak, one of the other things that we're trying to do with our on-site treatment is we need to get rid of pollutants. So BOD5, that's a 5-day biological oxygen demand. It's really not a contaminant of its own, but really it's a measure of the biologics that are out there and how much oxygen they consume. So if you think back on this page, if we've got these kind of critters and they need oxygen to survive and they consume so much oxygen, also the ones that are breaking down some of our other waste streams, such as the BOD or nitrogen, or sorry, TSS or nitrogen, things like that, that as they're breaking things down, they're consuming oxygen to do that. So if we only have one bug, he's only consuming a little bit. If we have millions of them, we're consuming a lot more oxygen. So that measurement gives us an idea of how much oxygen is being consumed in the breakdown of all these other pollutants or the viruses and pathogens that are out there. Besides the BOD5, TSS is suspended solids, FOG, fat, soil, grease. Our pathogens we looked at on the page before, and then other things that are, nitrogen, phosphorus, chlorides, even heavy metals, things like that. So some of those are nutrients for plants or other things. Others are just stuff that we need to attenuate or tie up in the soil. But that's what the soil is doing as part of a filter. And then where's that coming from? Well, we've got our human waste. We also have waste from a kitchen, stuff that goes down the drain, and then we have other things that everything that we put down the drain in a home is basically ending up in that septic tank. So any kind of detergent or household cleaning agent, or anything like that. If people are putting bleach and things down, that all ends up as part of that wastewater. We also have things like water softeners that we may have to deal with. I mean, they add a bunch of chloride, the salt, it's hard on it, and then other things. Sometimes we have commingled waste. We might have high strength waste, from a restaurant, or possibly a commingled industrial waste or something that we may have to deal with. Those are a little more rare and cause us other problems. But if we have something like that, we have to be aware of what its unique characteristics are. Is there something unique that we have to deal with? That's either going to be an increased BOD or some other pollutant that we're going to have to look out for. But basically, we need to treat the wastewater and then we also need to disperse it. So that's the key for getting rid of water on site is we have to do twofold things. We have to not only treat it and get rid of some of these pollutants or the biologics, but we also have to get it to go away. We have to get it to go someplace. We can put a pipe into a lake. We do a very good job at dispersing wastewater or in a river, getting it to go away, but we're not getting treatment. Um, Sometimes I can do really good treatment, but if I can't get water then to leave the site, that doesn't help me either. So we have to do a balancing act of making sure we get treatment and dispersal. And then also we got a little note down there that in Wisconsin, gray water is considered sewage. Some other places or some people from years ago did not choose to identify gray water or things like laundry water as sewage, but that, according to SPS 383, is considered sewage. So gray water or laundry water should not be directed out on a ground surface. That has to be treated also. So what are our wastewater concentrations here? Um, we're looking at domestic strength waste. Our code is all based around what we consider domestic wastewater, and those are listed in 383 44 parent 2 parent A. It says BOD is less than 220, TSS is less than 150, FOG is less than 30. So this is what's coming out of the septic tank and entering our drain field. So this is all considered domestic wastewater. And then out of a home, it shows these are what the averages are, about 158 for BOD, 54 TSS, 20 for FOG. So we're under domestic waste. And so what generates domestic? Well, a residence, obviously we know that, but other similar things too are domestic like would be like an apartment building, an office building, maybe they're, washing hands there, like a small little break room or something. They got a little coffee or they're microwaving some food or lunches that are brought in and bathrooms. So that's, pretty much domestic like things like assembly halls or assembly buildings like that, public buildings, and then schools without a kitchen would be similar to domestic. So maybe they're doing a shower or they got bathrooms or something like that there. So high strength waste, it's really not identified in the code as listed as high strength, but our code is situated only around domestic wastewater. So something that's above the 220 BOD, 150 TSS, 30 FOG Any of that was considered, well, what we deem as high strength. So our code doesn't address that. So we would need to get that wastewater strength down to domestic, or we're going to have an issue with it because we can't handle it in our code if it's high strength waste. So what would cause us some issues like that? So one would be, as an example, would be a restaurant. So some examples, and then restaurants can vary widely depending on what kind of restaurant and how their management is inside. But an average BOD out of a restaurant might be 500, which is way above the 220. TSS is 177, not quite so high, but still over the average. And then because there's a lot of cooking, a lot of grease and oils, FOG is extremely high. So those are some issues. Is that if everything that we do is designed around how many gallons we can put out per day per square foot on a certain type of soil, those are all based on the BOD of 220, TSS of 150, FOG of 30. And if we're above that, then the rest of our rules sort of don't apply because we're outside those parameters. So what we deem as high strength waste would be things like restaurants, schools, and churches, kitchens. There's a commercial kitchen that they're doing food prep, bars with food service. They're cooking food, frying food, dining halls, hospitals, things like that. So those are considered high strength because we know that they're going to be generating things that are above our domestic strength waste. So just something to be aware of, when we're looking at. I know it's not really the soil part of it, but this is sort of the background of when we design stuff or treat things. Because a lot of times you as a soil tester will be the first one out there on a site, and you're going to find out what they plan on doing, and then you'll have to sort of identify or talk with the designer about some concerns that if you know it's high strength right off the bat, you need to talk to find out what they're going to do because that will affect where you're going to test or what you're going to need to do for a soil test. A little bit about how that process works, the biologics. I mentioned before that the septic tank is an anaerobic digestion. It's anaerobic. It really should be not in the absence of oxygen. It should be actually low oxygen. So there is still some oxygen there, but very very little of it. Um, and that's what happens in the septic tank. And about 30% of organic matters materials are digested that way. And you'll get the sludge, you'll get the scum, that'll happen. So, lack of a better term, floaters float, sinkers sink. Some of that digestion will start to take place by the bacteria that are naturally present, and they'll break down, some of the bigger things. If some sugar or something gets through, or the big carbohydrates, they'll start breaking those into smaller, compounds, and slowly breaking some of the stuff down. So typically, the byproducts of that anaerobic digestion that you're going to be able to identify would be ammonia, methane, CO2, and hydrogen sulfide. And you probably can't identify the CO2, but you've probably smelled what sewer gas smells like, the hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, or you've been near like a swamp. Everything's underwater, low oxygen. And if you ever dug in there, the sort of swamp gas kind of smell, the rotten egg smell, hydrogen sulfide, it's an anaerobic process, and you'll know it when you smell it. Especially the ammonia. I know I used to golf on a golf course early mornings in Madison, right next to the DNR office. And I'd be out there with the DNR guy, and we could smell when the sewer plant had bypassed some raw sewage because you could smell the ammonia in the air. It was very apparent. We'd be out there at 6 in the morning and like, oh, you could smell the ammonia. Well, we got some calls to make at 8 o'clock when we get to the office because we could smell it. Aerobic digestion is different. Aerobic, just like doing an aerobics, the idea is to use more oxygen. It's a faster process, so the presence of oxygen, it's going to be a much faster process. It's a different set of bacteria. They're going to process things faster. So similar to analogy that you can think of is if you have a campfire, the flames are burning, but if you take a piece of cardboard or something and you fan the flames, what are you doing? You're introducing oxygen to that process, makes it much more robust. It's going to be a faster. So same thing here. If we have anaerobic digestion, it's going to be a slower process. You're going to have certain byproducts. Aerobic digestion is going to be much more vigorous or faster. And And that's how the aerobic, again, different set of bacteria, but they work much faster. And they can do a better process. So about 30% of organic is decomposed by anaerobic. You can get that up to 75, 80% through aerobic digestion or oxidation. And then ammonia, if we have that there, aerobic digestion, you can actually convert the ammonia to nitrate by further oxidation. And they have a different set of byproducts. So new cell mass, possibly, also CO2, but the nitrate and then water. So they have a different. That's why aerobic digestion, you don't have the ammonia or hydrogen sulfide smell. It's a different process, different smells, kind of thing. So how does our septic tank treatment work? It's an anaerobic process. Typically, we don't have oxygen in there or very low oxygen. Primary treatment, we said, well, before 30 to maybe 50%, and we will have solids accumulate in there. So the tank is meant to collect solids, and over time, we will have solids in there, things that just don't get broke down. Also, we will have things in there that are inorganic. So if you're out playing in the dirt when you're soil testing and you come in and wash your clothes, the sand, silt, and clay particles off your clothes are going to end up in that tank. They're not a biologic. They're not going to be broke down. Lint from your clothing is also going to end up out there possibly. And those are things that are just solids that need to be accumulated. Plus the biologic dead bodies out there from the little bugs that are breaking things down and other things that they can't break down more are going to settle out in the tank. And it's meant to do that. So that's why we have the 3-year pumping or inspection to go out there and take a look at that and see if it needs to be pumped out. But we're supposed to accumulate the sludge and the scum, the fats, oil, grease out there. And the best way to do that is just retention time, that we need to have enough capacity in those tanks to allow that liquid to settle out, allow that slower anaerobic process to take place before that liquid then goes out into your drain field. And then since 2000, we've required outlet filters, and those have no larger than 1/8 inch particles going out to the dispersal unit or the soil absorption unit, and that's just to keep it from plugging up the other. We want to keep the solids in the tank and not have them going out into your drain field. So this is what the septic tank looks like, sort of a cross section. Building sewers in from the left, just like the picture we saw earlier of the house. We have the scum, we have the sludge, we have the clear space. Then we have on the outlet pipe, we have a filter. Some older systems may not have a filter; they'll just have a baffle in there or a T, so liquid just can't, and also in the front there's a baffle. We don't want the liquid just shooting in, floating across the top and then right out the pipe. So it has to go sort of down into that zone and give it a chance to settle out. But that's basically what the septic tank treatment looks like. So, what are some soil treatment mechanisms that we have here? We can have aerobic or anaerobic processes occur depending on, is the soil like right in the cell? If we have a biomat and we possibly have some water sitting in or ponding a little bit, it may go anaerobic a little bit. It may have some aerobic treatment as it trickles down through the soil. We don't want to hydraulically push the water through. That's bullet point 3. We want to make sure the soil's unsaturated so that we get natural flow through there, but we don't want to be saturating it and pushing it through. And then second bullet point, physical, chemical, biological mechanisms. So we're going to have, and we'll talk about these more in detail when we get to the chemistry part of it. And the biology part of it, but absorption, the cation exchange, we're going to have nutrients and other things like heavy metals will be absorbed to the soil particles. We're also going to have biochemical things that are going to go on. So predation, just like in the big macro animal world, we'll have a lion will eat a gazelle or something like that. Well, we're going to have a big bad protozoa eat a smaller protozoa kind of thing or bacteria or something like that. And then also just conversion or retention time, just deactivation die off. So a lot of things they can't live outside of a host for a certain amount of time. They need to be able to react and complete their life processes. And so if they're just retained in the soil, they may just naturally die off or deactivate on their own because they don't have a host. And we talked about the unsaturated soil, and then also bullet point 4, we have to have enough soil to remove the pollutants. If we only have an inch of soil, maybe it does a really good job at doing all the processes up above. We just don't have enough time for it to work. So we have to have enough soil in order to do all the processes that we need to give time for nutrients to absorb, give time for biochemical predation conversion, have time for deactivation, die off, hold it there long enough. If we, and that's why we have a 3 foot separation. If we only had an inch of soil, we might do a great job, but we just don't have enough time for it to react. It's too much wastewater for too little soil. I also put in there that it could be possibly 2 feet if we are doing some pre-treatment. We may only need 2 foot vertical separation, but typically it's three, and in some cases could be five. And we'll talk about that later, where if we have coarse materials, we may need a larger separation because we don't want that, wastewater shooting through that soil too fast. And then also soil has to be permeable to air and water. So obviously if it's impermeable to water, if we can't get water to go through it, we can't get wastewater to go through it. And if we can't get water to go through it, we're also not going to get air to go through. So we're going to have problems with that. So here's a sort of a representation of our soil treatment. And this would be, conventional system in the ground. And what do we want to do for our treatment is we have our gravel bed there, and we have our the white dot is our pipe that we're looking at from the end, and we have our BOD, TSS, bacteria, viruses, nutrients, and we want that unsaturated aerobic zone, hopefully have some air exchange going on in there. And then we're having again, our predation, our die off, our attenuation, cation exchange capacity, things like that before we get to groundwater. So that would be our 3 foot separation or 3 foot vertical separation. Because once we get into that groundwater, then basically we're not having attenuation, we're not having treatment, and then it's just like a direct pipeline. So once we get to that groundwater, then those nutrients, viruses, bacteria, BOD, TSS, there's virtually no treatment, and then it's just a conveyor belt. So once they enter that groundwater, then it can go. We've seen cases where it can go miles and end up in somebody's well. Once it enters a zone of saturation, there's virtually no treatment, and then we run the risk of well pollution or surfacing out to groundwater or surface water, something like that. So as our wastewater goes in here, we want to slowly percolate down um, again and hopefully be treated before we get to groundwater, because once you're there, we're not getting any more treatment. So this is what it looks like for unsaturated flow. So those big tan and red outlined things, those are sort of our soil particles. The red is sort of our fungi and soil bacteria on a particle surface. And we'll talk more about this later, but our soil particles are negative charges. So they're sort of like, I guess you could think of them as like a Swiffer or something. They'll magnetically sort of charge the dust particles. Well, these will magnetically sort of hold the pathogens and other nutrients as they go through. But this one shows, especially with the viruses and pathogens, as they enter, they're going through the little gaps between the soil particles. We'll have pathogen die-offs in there, maybe predation from the soil fungi or other soil bacteria out there that are attacking them. But hopefully they're being held here long enough so that can happen. And then not only just physical filtration, them being held there physically, but also predation, die-off, retention. That's what's doing the treatment. So here's some numbers for unsaturated flow during soil treatment. We talked about BOD. Our code says we have to be under 220, but here's some numbers from research. We had raw waste of BOD was between 30 and 1147, and then our septic tank effluent where we needed to be was less than 220, but they had numbers from 39 to 861, and 1 foot below distribution media already they were down to zero, and 3 feet down to zero. So they did a wonderful job at treatment of BOD. Same thing with TSS. The fecal coliforms, which again are an indicator of viruses and pathogens, some big numbers with lots of zeros. And then they're looking at 1 foot below distribution media, they had 1 to 100. And then 3 feet below, they were basically down to zero. So that's why we have our separation distance. We want to make sure that we have retention time, kill off our viruses or pathogens. You can see viruses on row 4 there. Again, 0 to 1,000, 1 foot below, and 0 at 3 feet below. Nitrogen, very little. Total phosphorus, very little, is escaping 3 feet below. But basically, we did a really good job at cleaning up BOD, TSS, viruses and pathogens, those kind of things. And so it gives you sort of an idea on how good of a job soil treatment can accomplish for us. So what happens if we have saturated conditions? So if we do have saturated flow, what might be a potential for us? So here we have an instance where, if we're pushing wastewater through the soil, and let's say our water table is up higher, now we don't have a treatment zone. So what are we doing? We're basically discharging untreated wastewater, our BODs, TSS, bacteria, viruses, nutrients, right into that groundwater. So if we miss our call as a soil tester and don't accurately decide where groundwater is or identify where groundwater is, maybe groundwater was down the day we're out there, but in the springtime it looks like this. Again, we're not getting that predation die off or treatment, and so if we're discharging wastewater right into that zone of saturation, it's again, it's a conveyor belt or a pipeline right to that well. And so things are not getting broke down and they're going to end up in that well. And now we just short circuited our treatment. So we don't want to have a saturated condition. That's going to cause us some problems. So here's sort of a close up. Our soil treatment, saturated flow, pathogens are in. We're not the soil particles. There's nothing to hold them there because they're on the water park ride. They're riding the water through the soil. They're not getting held to the soil particles. The predation die off isn't happening. They're not getting held there, and they're just coming in the top and out the bottom. They're just riding through. There's no contact time, and then we're not getting our treatment. So again, if we have systems like this where we have wastewater, these are old dry wells installed right in the groundwater, we're running the risk of contamination. It's going to get into our lake or to our well, and we're going to cause problems. So that's why we have to make sure when we do our soil test that we accurately identify that limiting factor, accurately identify where that system can go to make sure that we're not short circuiting our treatment. So in this case, instead of having and system like an old dry well. So it's not that the dry wells weren't functional. They did. I think they were severely undersized, the old dry wells, but a lot of them, they did not look at where water was. They just looked at dispersal. So in a case like this, we do a really good job at dispersing things because we're right in the groundwater. Anything you put out there is going to leave the site. We're not worried about that, but we're getting no treatment. So a lot of these, we have to put a mound in because by putting that mound out here, now we're going to be able to get our vertical separation, we're going to get our treatment and above that groundwater, that limiting factor, and then we'll be able to still disperse it, but we get our treatment first and then we get our dispersal afterwards. So the next thing I want to talk about is a little bit about biological nitrification, denitrification. So our fecal matter, urea, animal protein that comes in, we have our anaerobic process in our septic tank, converts it to ammonia, ammonium. And then if we add oxygen back in, go aerobic, we can convert it to nitrate. And then if we go back to anaerobic and add carbon, then we can convert it to nitrogen. So our process of just going out to the drain field, we got an anaerobic take and then we got some aerobic out in the drain field. We're not getting total denitrification. We're just converting it from ammonia or fecal matter to ammonia to nitrite. But really to go back to get it to atmospheric nitrogen back to the atmosphere, we really need to basically go anaerobic and organic carbon. So there are some pretreatment systems that can do that, but our typical design for a pouts does not necessarily do denitrification. So some of these in here we have some that will either do a recirculating media, either gravel or textile foam cubes or something like that. Several types of ATUs or aerobic treatment units. Um, will do that because they have different zones where they go through the anaerobic tank, add oxygen, and then they go back anaerobic again. So there are some treatment units out there that can do denitrification or remove quite a bit of nitrogen from them. Also, want to talk about things related to dilution and source reduction. We can do dilution to meet a standard. So the solution to pollution is dilution kind of thing. We talked about like high strength waste. Maybe we can offset it with something that's lower strength waste to reduce our concentrations in here. Other things like larger lots or spreading it out over a larger area through mass loading. So even though we may have a high number, if instead of 220 BOD, if we're at 440, we can use twice as much land, possibly to size it twice as big, to give it more space to reduce that wastewater load. or possible source reduction. We might be able to do, gray water, black water separation, get the black water or the high strength water from a kitchen or something and segregate that out to possibly a holding tank instead of going out to the drain field. So just some other things to look at when you're the first person out there as a soil tester about, how to handle things, or just be aware of the wastewater strengths and concentrations. But we also want to look at, when we do the design, which ties in with you're doing the soil test about where you're looking at, for the site, is, how do we evaluate that site out there, or how should the design take place? So we have two different kinds of systems, one on the left, one on the right. Those dotted lines are elevation contours. So you think of the top one and maybe 100 foot, the middle one is maybe 98 foot, and the bottom line is maybe 96-foot contour. So the land slope goes down towards the bottom of the page or the bottom of the slide here. And if we do one on the left, we're going down the contour or with the contour, and we're concentrating everything. If the system's narrow, all the waste is coming out in a narrow band, where if we spread it out along the contour on the right, we're having a better design. So here, if we had a discharge plume, so to speak, everything that goes in there is in this discharge plume, as opposed to the one on the right we're discharging here. So it'd be the same thing as if somebody wanted to water, if you wanted to water your lawn, do I just put the hose in one spot? I'm going to have it's going to flood out in one spot, as opposed to if I connect the hose to a sprinkler and spread it out over a larger area. Again, concentration dilution also works for us out on the landscape. More area, we can spread it out over a larger distance. So that's an important concept to understand too, is when we test areas, if you tested a very narrow site up and down, you know, of the contour, that's not going to be suitable because our codes aren't going to allow somebody to design a system on the left. We're going to have to design on the right. So you have to make sure you test enough area to spread that cell out. If all your test holes were sort of more of a vertical orientation, you didn't test enough area. They won't be able to fit a system in your tested area or design something that way. And this also ties in. I know we don't get too much into this, but soil treatment and our designs that we would have, the same thing, goes in the design of a system. Where we put the number of holes that we have for orifice density. We want to make sure we're maximizing the area. If you have really wide holes like this, you'll see the two blue sort of trapezoid kind of things show where we're discharging. But if we put another hole in the middle, now we're getting better coverage. We're using our soil, we're using our media that we're putting out there. So that's an important thing, and it's more of like in the design concept. But again, you should need to be aware of it, that we're even when they design systems, we want to have unsaturation flow. We don't want to be physically forcing water or wastewater through that soil. Get back into it. Apparently, I've been talking slow. We got a lot of slides to get through, so I'll try to speed up the process a little bit here. So, I want to talk a little bit about soil treatment, vertical, horizontal considerations here. And we want to keep systems shallow. It helps with vegetative uptake, a little bit of evapotranspiration. There isn't much of that, but still, anything that we can help to basically get rid of the water on the site, and also more retention time. So if we only have 3 feet, well, that's okay. That's the code minimum. But if we had 5 feet separation, that's better for us, and then we're going to do better treatment. So no need to bury systems deep. We have less oxygen exchange, less vegetative uptake, less separation distance. It's better to have a larger one. And the same thing with horizontal setbacks, increased travel time, left to right, so to speak, across the horizon or across the site. We're going to have, better treatment. So I want to mention linear loading rates. We sort of alluded to this before. The design of our systems or the area that we test makes a difference. So on the left, if we have 100 gallons per day and we have a 100 square foot bed, but it's 100 foot long, 1 foot wide, we're only discharging 1 gallon per lineal foot, and that's what a linear loading rate is. So we just have a little bit, those little red arrows, we just have a little bit of water going down each one, as opposed on the right, we have still 100 square foot, 10 by 10 square, but now we're discharging each foot across those 10 is discharging 10 gallons. So we have a high linear loading rate. So it's important for us, not only doing the site work, but when they design, especially to make sure that we're spreading those systems out over a longer area, so we have a longer linear or a better linear loading rate. And so this is the difference here. If we have length times width, if we cut the width in half, the cell in half, we still have the same linear loading rate because we still have the same length. But on the one on the right, if we cut the length in half, now we've doubled the linear loading rate. So it's something to be aware of, is that I know we had some people that, and if you could downsize instead of 4.5 by 100 cell, they would do a 4.5 by 50. Well, you just effectively doubled the linear loading rate. It would have been better to have a 2.25 by 100, because then our linear loading rate didn't go up. So in Wisconsin, these are some rough numbers. About 34%, or about a third of Wisconsin's population, uses decentralized wastewater or septic systems, and just under 2 million people, 730 households, probably a little more than that. That was, um, I believe, the 2010 census. I haven't checked numbers for the 2020. But we have about 800,000 systems inventory, but there are some commercial ones in there, like bars and churches and things like that. But we're probably 750 or 770,000 households out there. Wisconsin's been, again, regulating septic systems since 1914. 1914 is when our first plumbing code came in. Counties were required to regulate septic systems starting in 1968. We previously been Department of Health and Industry, Labor, Human Relations, Commerce, and now DSPS. And when we first started, $1 of each permit was sent to the state to provide funding. Current fee is $100. So sort of a timeline here. Percolation tests came around in 41, percolation procedures in 69, verifying a 3 foot below system, certification of soil testers in 74, reference of soil modeling indicating wetness in 79, morphologic evaluations in 91 started, perk tests were banned in 94. In 2000, COM 83, because we were Department of Commerce back then, no longer requires soil tests for subdivisions, and some other changes. And then 2018, we removed EH 115, or that was the old perk test that was removed um, from consideration. So we don't even do that anymore. So that gives you sort of a quick breakdown about sort of the soil testing and how it worked in Wisconsin. So some of the requirements, we have the statutes, which is the law. This is passed by the legislature to give us legal standing to do what we do. And we can't do anything without having legislature enact some kind of law. So we have 160, chapter 160, groundwater standards as part of the governmental units. 59.70 requires them to have a POUTS ordinance. And then 145 is the plumbing statute. It talks about licensing plumbers, permits, and things like that. Um, it also defines what is plumbing. So any kind of piping fixtures, appliances, it goes on and on. You can read the whole thing there. Um, but basically, if you're connecting pipes together, that's plumbing. There's also some advertising restrictions. We're not going to get too much into that. That's more for the general plumbers, but they can't be a plumber without having a plumbing license. So you can't pretend you're a plumber or say I'm going to fix your broken pipes or do any of that without being a plumber. And then it also gets into, under 145, deals with things like sanitary permits, that you can't do plumbing or put on a private wastewater treatment system connected to plumbing unless you have a sanitary permit. So you can't install a tank, you can't sell a tank for retail sale unless there's a sanitary permit for that. And also deals with building on sewered property, that no city, town, or village can issue a building permit for a structure unless there's a valid sanitary permit for that site. So if people are looking to build before they can even start their footing or foundation or their building, they need to know they have sanitary capabilities on there. So they either already have to have a system or they have to have a sanitary permit for a new site before they can start out there. And then the requirements, the code is sort of the rules. So the statute gives us the overlying authority to say, here's the law that says you need a permit, you need a license, et cetera, et cetera. And the code basically fleshes out how we're going to accomplish that. So that tells us sort of, the how we go about meeting the statute. And these are the ones you need to be aware of. 302 deals with fees, 303 is variances, 305 is licenses, and then we have the group from 381 to 391, which is more the plumbing ones, definitions, general plumbing, the pouts that we talked about before, on-site systems. 384 is products, 385 is soil testing, and then we have some odd ones in here: boat and onshore sewage facilities, Wisconsin fund, which is currently unfunded, and then sanitation or non-plumbing sanitation, things like privies and outhouses and stuff like that. And then also other ones like NR 140 groundwater quality, things like that. Component manuals, these, a statutes describe the laws, code describe the rules, but component manuals also describe specific designs that are like a sort of de facto part of the rule. They're like a cookbook method to, if you do like a mound component manual and you follow that, you're going to get a code compliant mound that's going to meet the code and meet the statute there. So they outline specific ways to achieve the code or achieve the statute. And so they're sort of like they're referred to in the code, um, but they're not really code. Um, but you have to follow them if you're building a mound. You need to follow that version. Otherwise, you can do what they call an individual site design and still meet the rule. But it's sort of a guaranteed way. If you follow the component manual, you're going to have a code compliant design. Component manuals are an approved product. They're listed in 384.10. So again, they're outlined in a code that they have to go through an approval process, and just make sure that you're using the most up-to-date component manual. There are other ones that are previous that have expired, and so we had a version 1 at one time, we had a version 2, and now we're at a 2.1. I think that grades are up to 3.0. So make sure you're using one. They should have expiration dates or approval dates on the front. So just make sure you're using an up-to-date one if you have to refer to one of them. What if there's a conflict between a code and a component manual? Component manual isn't the law, isn't a statute. So statutes are law to create administrative code. The code is the rule. They take precedence. So if there is an error or a conflict between the two, you always have to go with what the statute, the law says, or then what the administrative code says. Also, there may be an approval of a product or something that goes out there. Component manual provides a method for the system design only, but there may be some particulars for a certain product that you'd have to follow. And again, if you don't meet the total component manual design, you can submit it as an ISD, and look at it that way. And then beyond our rules would be possibly a county ordinance. I mentioned early on that the counties may have some latitude for like their maintenance program to put additional requirements in. So there may be something specific in a county ordinance. Usually that relates to violations or when inspections are required and things like that. But there may be some requirements in a county ordinance that you may have to pay attention to. I know some counties do charge for soil on sites, and they require on siting of the soil test. So you'd have to check with that county to see if there's something that you need to comply with. Some other basic principles here. Why we do what we do is 382 states where plumbing fixtures exist in a building, not connected to public sewer or city sewer, that there has to be some kind of suitable provision made for treating that. You basically got to put some kind of septic system or bouts out there. And then 3D302 says any situation where domestic wastewater is collected or conducted by means of plumbing, you need to have a treatment. You have to either go to wastewater treatment facility, so a public facility, or you'd have to do a POUTS, one of the two. So if you have more questions about licensing, you can get that to our DSPS. Just type it in there and look for licensing. Otherwise, this QR code, if you got a minute here, you can take a screenshot of that. Otherwise, again, you just search DSPS licensing, and that'll get you to our webpage, and you'll be able to look up any of the requirements for master plumbers and CSTs and things like that. And then we have license requirements for different activities. I'm not going to get too much into that about who can do what, but basically you can't be doing plumbing, you can't be gluing pipe, or I mean, you can be the gopher. If the plumber says, "Hey, grab me a 10-foot stick of schedule 42-inch," you can do that, but you can't be fitting the piping together at all or anything like that, because that requires to be a plumber. We got a lot of background there, and now we're going to get into soil and site evaluations. 385 sets forth requirements for evaluating, reporting soil and site characteristics. And again, CSTs are the ones that perform the soil evaluation. They're the only ones that can do it. Even if you're a professional soil scientist, you still had to have a CST license in the state of Wisconsin to do a soil profile. Site evaluations can be done by many different people, and that would be slope setbacks, topography, mapping out where a building is or something like that. But again, if you're out there doing the profile as part of a CST, you're probably going to be doing the site plan also. And soil tester exam information, you can get it, again off of here, or if you just search DSPS, certified soil tester, you can find that information also. Credentialing 305 lists, all what's required to, what the fees are to apply, how you need to do it, things like that. Credentialing folks, they have information on exam dates, materials, license terms, continuing education, things like that. That's all under 305. Not going to delve too much into that. Exam site locations, want to point out that you can go onto our website. Everything's through licensee. You can find out where the exam dates are. These are the typical locations we have for DSPS for our exams. If you want to take the CST license, you can go to these locations. I also wanted to mention, you can bring any kind of code book, manual, notes, textbooks, things like that, but they have to be in a bound format. So 3-hole punched in a binder would be suitable also, but they have to be in a binder. They can't just be loose sheets. No electronic devices like phones or Apple Watches. So if you need a calculator, don't bring your phone. They're not going to let you have it. And also the last one, don't go to the exam unless you received a notice. Some people says I signed up for it, I went there, and they wouldn't let me in. So even though you applied for it and thought you were signed up, until they send you that confirmation, don't assume that that session is a go. Just want to make sure that you're also aware of Pearson View. They're a company that we contracted with as of 2024. They have various locations around the state. There is a higher fee to take them. They're just a testing company, but you can get to one of these locations to take the exam. The problem is that the CST you can't take through Pearson View, because the CST exam also requires hand texturing of some samples, coloring of samples, and a monolith. But if you are interested in taking like the Pouts Inspector or the designer's exam or something like that, those you can do through Pearson View, but you can't do the CST. So just be aware of that. If you're trying to sign up and hear about Pearson View, you can't do the CST through them because of the physical component of having the samples and the profile. License terms, again, we're not going to get into this just for time, but 305, it spells out, 4-year license terms. You got to get continuing education credits. Make sure that you're getting those early and not waiting till last minute. Every year we get somebody close to the expiration saying, hey, I need 12 credits. They go, oh, when's your license expire? Next week. Probably not going to happen. So make sure you get your credits in early. And here's some useful websites. You can also search a lot of this. Document sales, like I said, isn't so helpful because now with home computers and or even going to Office Max, you're going to be a lot cheaper just printing it out yourself or keeping a digital copy. Licensing requirements, again, you can search for all the different license requirements through our website. You can go to licensee um, on our website and look up your license, check your license. Product approvals are in there through ISLA. And then our POUTS page is very helpful. You can get all of our forms, publications, standard plan pages, a lot of links on that. So, how do we know that we have a failure out there? Stop, look, and instead of listen, stop, look, and smell. I mentioned that before. Is that ammonia or the hydrogen sulfide gives you a good look at it or a good smell and know what's going on out there. But indication of failure, we got odors, lush grass, contamination that we know about, backups, outfall pipes, ponding, things like that. Let us know that we have failures. So these are, why we're out here doing the soil test and what we're trying to identify. Um, you know, these are obviously you can tell things aren't working right. We've got discharges to the ground surface or ponding. The smells, things like that. These are obviously failures or problems that we have and what we're trying to address. And you can see that the soils are not doing an adequate job at dispersing the wastewater or treating it. So we mentioned before suitable soil concept, and that's our vertical separation. So We need to have a zone, and we talked about a 3-foot zone or possibly a 2 feet if we're using highly treated effluent, pre-treating it. We need to have that above saturation or bedrock. So on the left, on the bottom left, you can see shallow bedrock. And on the upper left, you can see water. Now, it's not necessarily water table. We'll get this argument. Some that come out there, well, my water table's at 185 feet is where my well was drilled. What are you saying? I need a mound because you're saying I got water up here? Well, maybe not today, but based on the color indicators, we'll talk about those later. Um, Maybe in the spring of the year, water table is that high. It's perching up there, or you've got, the spring, the runoff can't handle it, and we can't get the water to disperse. And if we've got water ponded there, like we talked about before, we're not going to get our treatment, and then it's just a direct conduit to um, surface water or a well. So our suitable soil is our distance above, usually 3 feet above groundwater or bedrock. So this is what seasonal saturation looks like, and we're going to get a lot more into detail with our future training, especially when we talk about the chemistry of it. But these color patterns in here, especially these red blotches noted on the left, and the red blotches on the right, and in addition, those gray blotches. You see how the background color is grayish. That indicates seasonal saturation. They're called redox features. That's short for redoxamorphic, which is a chemical process, reduction, oxidation, and we'll talk more than you'll probably want to know about that later. But it's a chemical process in the soil that indicates water is there at some point of the year for a significant portion to allow these chemical processes, biological chemical processes, to take place. And it leaves these color patterns in the soil and tell us that at some time of the year there is seasonal saturation that does occur. Bedrock, a little bit easier to spot sometimes. Obviously we can see in this picture, that's rock. We understand that's bedrock. Where it gets a little bit difficult is we have, like up here in the Marathon County area by Wausau, we have some rotten granite that you can pick it up and you can crush it easily in your hands, but it's granite that's highly decomposed, it's highly weathered. They use it a lot for road base up here. And if we have greater than 50% by volume, over 2 millimeters in size, and we'll talk about that later, anything under 2 millimeters is soil, anything over 2 millimeters is a rock fragment. So if we have more than 50% is rock, and it comes from something weathered in place, not transported in by a glacier or something like that. But if it's more than 50% rotten granite, then it's considered bedrock, and that's a limitation for us. We're not getting our treatment by going through that. Also, weakly consolidated sandstone or something like that. You'll get in some areas where the sandstone, you bring it out, it's loose once you dig it out, but in place, you have a hard time pushing a knife blade or your putty blade into it. If you're in the soil pit or even digging it with a shovel, it's very resistant. But once you dig it out, it's loose, but in place, it's weakly consolidated, and that's considered a limitation or considered bedrock for us also. So dispersal issues, we need to have, or we need to get treatment. So again, we need a limiting factor. We need our separation distance above that to make sure we're getting treatment. But then also for, besides treatment, we have to get dispersal. We talked, that's the second part, is how do we get wastewater to move away from the site? Is how is it going to move vertically through the soil? How is it going to move horizontally through the soil? How is it going to get into the natural subsurface zones? Do we have things like solely permeable soils? Do we have a massive zone or something that's weakly cemented or firm? Or do we have wetness? Where's it going to go if it's discharging to a zone of saturation eventually and we can't get the water to leave the site? So those are some things we need to take into account when we're doing our soil test. So some dispersal systems of the past, the bottom left is a cesspool. Basically, it's a septic tank, dispersal tank, all in one. Um, Liquid just goes into a hole in the ground and seeps away. Not getting great treatment. Um, Dry wells up above in the upper left. Um, they had a septic tank which did our primary digestion in a seepage pit. The problem was a lot of those, they only looked at dispersal. They did not look at our separation distance. And so that's why we have a lot of them. And even in the lower right, you can see a different version of it. Why a lot of those don't work so well in Wisconsin. They're still used mostly in the southwest part of the country where they have, like Arizona, New Mexico, where they don't have water for quite some distance. Other than that, we don't see them around here. And then outfall daylights, you'll still see people with a pipe out to the ditch kind of thing. And again, great dispersal, no treatment. So types of dispersal today, we have the conventional or an in-ground system. We could have a conventional that has a dose or a pump to it, and then we could pressurize that, have an in-ground pressure. If we don't have enough suitable soil, we might be doing an at-grade or a mound. I have drip on there. I haven't seen one in probably 20 years, but there's also some other kinds of systems, mounds in a box, and some other, unique ones. But the base one is if we don't have any soil absorption system, would just be a holding tank, just a waterproof tank, a watertight tank. All the waste goes into the tank. When it's full, alarm goes off. You pump it out, take it to a treatment plant. So usually those are very poor soil conditions, or could be a site where they just don't have any area available to put a drain field in. We're really restricted on that. Sometimes seasonal or lake shore or something where there's no room for them to go. An in-ground system, we would go out of our septic tank that we've looked at before, and then we would have our gravel or chambers or some of the passive pretreatments that are out there now. And then we have our minimum vertical separation distance. Usually you're 3 feet below our system, above high groundwater or bedrock. And most of the time that's just gravity flow. It just, a gallon goes into the septic tank, a gallon goes out to our drain field. Then we could have in-ground pressure, sort of the same thing. It's just that in-ground pressure we may use because either the drain field's above the septic tank, we can't get water to go up the hill, or sometimes we may want to pressurize it or pump it. The smaller laterals, instead of a 4-inch lateral, we get by with possibly inch and a half or two, gets a little bit shallower, keep it in the ground kind of thing. But very close to the same. It's just that we're doing it under pressure instead of gravity. An at grade is a little bit different. An at grade, our vertical separation, instead of having, let's say, 5 feet of suitable soil where we can meet our 3 foot separation, have our foot for a system, have a foot for cover. If we only have 3 feet of suitable soil, we still meet our vertical separation, but we can't build it in the ground. What do? We build our dispersal unit at grade or right on top of the ground. And then we bring our topsoil in to cover it off to keep it from freezing. So that's what an at grade is. And then a mound would be what if we don't have, what if we only have a foot of suitable soil? Now what do? We still need 3 foot separation. We would bring 2 feet of sand in. So 2 feet of sand, 1 foot of natural soil, still meet our 3 foot. What if we have 2 feet of good soil? Well, you bring 1 foot of sand in, 2 feet of good soil, we still have our 3 foot separation. So that's where we have the adjustable vertical separation distance is whatever the natural soil provides, whatever sand we have to bring in to make up 36 inches, we build our system and then cover it, and then we're set to go. So all the systems work the same. They're all based on a 3 foot separation. It's just whether we can get natural soil to do it for us or whether we have to bring in artificial soil. And drip, I'm not going to talk too much about that. We don't hardly see that anymore. But if you want to get really shallow with pre-treatment, you can put some drip lines in and disperse it right up in the growing zone kind of thing. And then advanced treatment, we may want to add something extra in there, like an aerobic treatment or a sand filter. There's peat filters, constructed wetlands, other new technologies to come out, like the passive pretreatments, which are sort of a hybrid between a dispersal unit and treatment. And these are ones that just basically do a better job at cleaning up the wastewater so the soil doesn't have to work as hard. And if we do that, we might get credits depending on how they're situated, either a higher loading rate, smaller drain field, or we get a credit to the vertical separation. So typically things like aerobic treatment units, they're interjecting air into a system. And again, we're going aerobic then, and we're, sort of fanning the flames of that biology, making it do a better treatment. And we're going to have lower BOD, TSS, reduced pathogens. We're going to get some credits and get a higher loading rate for them. Other ones, there's some inoculators. They don't work so much off of air, but basically work off of adding bacteria into a system. Um, but again, aerobic treatment units, faster process than anaerobic. You can see the wastewater down on the lower right. Some of it can be so clean it almost looks like drinking water. Still some pathogens and stuff in it, possibly, but they do a really good job at reducing BOD, TSS, and getting rid of a lot of stuff. Sand filters, not going to talk too much about them. Basically, sand filters are sort of like a mound. Prior to a mound, you're bringing in a bunch of sand, percolating it through, letting it get its treatment. Then in this one, a single pass, you're basically collecting it and discharging it out. Um, we don't see them much anymore because they're expensive, because you're basically building a big mound and then discharging it to another mound or something, another drain field. So it's like having two systems. Um, so they're expensive and the upkeep on them's a little bit much, but and then constructed wetlands, haven't seen many of those in the state, mostly because we have this thing called winter. If everybody's looking outside, they don't work the greatest in the middle of winter. The biology and everything sort of goes dormant, and they're not as effective as they are, um, for instance, like if you're in the southern tier of states. But they do clear up the water just as good as ATUs and other things. They do a very good job at treatment when they're running. Peat filters, there's some of those are out there. Peat filters, they have some kind of coconut husk. Basically, it's a unit with the organic matter in it. Does a very good job at treating nitrates, reducing BOD, TSS, just a different treatment. Sort of look like this. And some of the new technologies that we have out here, these Elgin units, the GSF, Geomats, the Presbys. We've got sort of the arrow fins that are out there. So there's some new technologies that get these are in conjunction with sand, so they're a dispersal unit, but they're also a pretreatment. They get some treatment credit. They get the higher loading rates. So a little bit different, but then again, you have to be familiar with them as a soil tester to understand that, how much area do I need to test. If they're going to go with one of these units, you might possibly be able to get into a smaller area. And then we talked about the non-plumbing sanitation. You always have the route if you want to go with the pit privy. I was out on a site, I believe it was 2 years ago, up here in Marathon County. Was doing an audit and looking at the installation of the system, and they're putting a new system in. And I asked them, well, where's the well? And he goes, not in yet. And I go, okay, well, where's the old well? Didn't have one. So the system they were putting in was actually the first outs for that home. He had no running water and he had a privy. And he said that this guy is probably in his 60s, but he said his girlfriend said she would not be moving into the farmhouse with them until they got uh, running water. So it's always an option. You can always still put a privy out there. And for those that don't think that's legal yet, we still do it for the DNR, campgrounds and things like that. There are privies that are still installed throughout the state every year. Stormwater, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but stormwater infiltration as part of your CST license, you are also licensed to do evaluations for stormwater. Very similar to what we do for pouts. There's vertical separation to groundwater or bedrock. Basically, you're doing the same profile. You're looking at the same criteria, and you hand it off to somebody that would usually an engineer that's going to design a stormwater system, and they'll take your information and go from there. But the evaluation of the soils doesn't really change. It's just what they're going to do with it on the other end is that they may design a stormwater infiltration system. So as far as the soil reviews go, the soil tester has to submit the original soil test to the county upon completion, is what it says. We understand that sometimes people are hesitant, if they haven't been paid or something. I just recommend don't finish the soil test. Um, but once you're complete, you are supposed to send it in to the county. Then once you're complete with that soil test, the counties will review that soil test within 6 months of submittal. We ask the counties to review this quicker the better because, if you just submitted it yesterday and I'm reviewing it today and say, hey, I got some issues, I want to take a look out there. It's easier to go out there now than if I wait 6 months or you did a soil test, let's say back in early August, and then now I'm saying, yeah, I want to review that. Well, weather conditions don't really allow us to dig out there, or it may be more difficult to review that soil test. But again, check with the county, see if they have any fees for those soil sites. So soil verification, some counties on-site all soil evaluations. The state or the county can ask for verification at any time. So don't be surprised if you're doing a soil test and they come out there and say, "Hey, I want to verify it." Maybe it's they don't understand part of your description. Maybe you're not aware that there's already a soil report for that site out there. Maybe you're calling it a mound, and the previous soil report from 10 years ago calls it a conventional or something. So there may be a conflicting report or something different. Or you're calling it a mound and everybody else in the neighborhood is conventional and they want to know why you're different. It could very well be that you didn't do anything wrong, that the soils, you know that's what the soils are, but they may call out for various things. But if you're also unsure about a site, call the county for help, or call any of the field people here at the state. That's what we're here for. We'll come out and give you some help on the sites. Obviously we don't want to go out on every site with you, but if you do have a difficult site or don't understand something, I mean, that's what we're here for. Also, if there's fill material on a site, non-natural or non-native soil, then we're going to have to come out from the state. Most likely, we're going to do an on-site and take a look at it. Sanitary permits, we talked about these. You have to have a sanitary permit in order to do an on-site wastewater system, or even sell a tank. So we got to have the soil test first before we can do a plan to get the permits. There may be some local permitting. I mentioned that before, that they may require like a soils on site or things. Um, they may also have some local ordinances that prohibit the use of holding tanks for a system of choice or limit their use. So if you have um, a new lot or new house and the holding tank is the only suitable thing, they may not allow that to be developed. So just something to be aware of, that what you're getting into is, if the county restricts holding tanks for limited use or new use, and you're looking on a soil survey and you tell the homeowner this isn't a good shot, you're most likely not going to get something. Just to prepare yourself before you go out there, maybe something you may want to ask for payment up front, because they're probably not going to pay you if you go out there and tell them no, you're not getting a system, even though you knew that from the start. So just be aware of some things like that, what the local ordinances may require. Reconnections, if they have a system out there already, but they're reconnecting to it, you may have to go out there and do some soil investigation to verify that the system is still meets its separation distance. There's a whole list of rules associated with that we're not going to get into, but there may be some, not necessarily a full soil test, but you may need to do a boring to verify that it meets its separation distance. And that ties with any of the older systems that, even if you have an old dry well, if it meets its separation distance and it was sized accordingly at the time it was installed, they can continue to use that as long as it meets its separation distance and it was installed legally at that time. So the old perk test, I'd mentioned those. We got our perk tests on the left, we got our soil evaluation on the right. No more perk tests. They're done, they're gone. They just pretend they don't exist. So if you have that information, I mean, whatever you can obtain from it, um, great for you. But really, I wouldn't trust or rely on any of that information that's on there. Because again, when they were doing that, they weren't necessarily looking at a morphological evaluation. Maybe there was some crossover time there for a couple years. They were, but again, I wouldn't trust any of that data. I would, make sure you gather your own data. Also, we have SPS 38303. If you are doing evaluation or soil evaluation, that any systems installed prior to 1969, December 1st, 1969, they only need a 2 foot separation above groundwater bedrock. And the reason that is because we know those old systems have a well developed biological mat in them, and they're getting better treatment because of that biomat, and therefore they only need a 2 foot separation. So just be aware that if you do go on a soil test and say, oh, you don't meet your 3 foot, there is this exception out there for those older systems. So options for existing systems, I mean, either it's compliant, it meets the code. Sizing, you can't really have a system underside, but we may be able to look at some things, sizing per capita or something like that. Non-compliant systems, we don't allow cesspools since 1914. If they've expanded, it's a three-bedroom home, but now you know it's five, or it's no longer a three-bedroom home, it's a daycare for 20 kids or something like that beyond its floats and lows capacity, or it's failing as defined in 145 stats, and that would be discharge to ground surface, discharge to surface water. You don't have the vertical separation, or it's backing up into structure. Those are the code-defined failures. Change of loads and flows. Not going to worry too much about that. Loads and flows, basically what that entails is that if we're getting into, for instance, here we got a three-bedroom home occupied by four persons, they want additional bedroom. We can't have an undersized system, but what we can do is size per capita. So three-bedroom, we've sort of figured there's two people per bedroom. It's allowed to have six people there. So if they want to add an additional bedroom, they could do that. They're only using four persons capacity or two-bedroom capacity right now, and if they wanted to add that extra bedroom, though, they'd have to sign an affidavit and record it on their deed saying that that's limited to six-person occupancy. So if they want to add, before they can get that building permit, they have to look at, remember, we have to look at the sanitary permit, make sure it's being addressed. So they should not be issuing them a building permit for that extra bedroom until we look at this or the county looks at this to make that determination. But may not necessarily be something that we'd have to do as a soil tester, but just to be aware of, instead of doing a soil test and looking at modifying the system, that would be an avenue for them. If it's a load determination, what the we talked about BOD, how much the strength of the wastewater is, they can do sampling to determine what that is, and it has to be six readings over or within 30 consecutive days. So you don't have to do it, 6 days in a row, but you just can't have your readings outside of 30 days. So as an example, on the bottom, you take your readings and then divide it by the number of days or number of samples, gets you your BOD average. So some of the things that we know are high strength waste, daycares, beautician shops, those may even be industrial waste or hazardous waste if you're doing a lot of, perms and things like that. But if it's just a cut and style kind of place, still we may have some issues. Community-based residence facilities, group homes and things like that. Those typically generate high waste because the amount of meals and washing that they do and medications, things like that. And then other things like, kennels or things. Those are, well, the kennel runs themselves may be an industrial waste or the DNR, or they may be high strength waste, depending on what they're doing. So things to be on the outlook for. Also, if you look in their Appendix 383, you can go through there and it lists sort of our commercial facilities. And you'll see the third one down says bar or cocktail lounge. No meals served is an A, but we'll anticipate the A's are basically those that are anticipated to be high strength waste. B's, if you look down at church, those are going to be what they call an at risk, or there may potentially be a high strength waste. So there'll be some in here that will flag out that it's going to be a high strength waste or non high strength waste for you. You can see those here, the A's and B's. Kitchen in a church and daycare facilities are going to be potentials. So high strength waste and at risk. Again, our code is domestic wastewater. So anything that's high strength above the BOD, TSS, and FOGs, we're going to have some problems. Either you're going to have to do some kind of pretreatment to knock it down to residential, or we're going to have to segregate that high strength waste out and deal with it separately somehow. If you're a new facility and we don't know what it is, and you think that maybe we're not, you can be an at risk. You could build it. The designer would have to put in protocols in place to say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and then we're going to run the test. And if we do come back as high strength, then we're going to, we've already got the tank there, or we're going to drop a tank and put free treatment in, or something like that. Existing facilities really shouldn't be an at risk, because if you're existing, how do we know if you're high strength or not? Well, you're there, sample it, and then we'll find out. So that's sort of the difference between high strength and an at risk. And then I want to mention large pouts. So if you're a soil tester out there testing out an area, be aware for large scale pouts that if you have a system of over 12,000 gallons per day, the DNR is going to have to be involved, and they may have some additional requirements. So How this is done exactly, we were working with the DNR on an MOU. That's a memorandum of understanding between our agencies, and this slide's over a year old, and it's still accurate. It's still under revision. We were just notified the DNR stopped working on that, and they may resume it later this year, for whatever that means. But if you think you may have a system over 12,000 gallons, or under the same ownership and even on multiple parcels or multiple properties, if I own whatever XYZ campground on one side and then I own XYZ's apartment condominium complex on another parcel or another property, if you have common ownership and they're within 1,500 feet of each other and they're more than 12,000 gallons total, let us know right away, because there may be additional requirements, which is going to affect what you're out there doing your soil test for. Also going to affect what you're going to have to gather for your background data, your plot plan. You're going to have to show all that information of what's out there so somebody can do an accurate design. So again, once you're over 12,000, we have to notify the DNR. It's a joint review between the DNR and, my boy, this is old commerce, DSPS. And so a state sanitary permit is issued and a specific or WPDS permit is issued out there. And also, we run into non-domestic wastewater. Be aware of that if you ever get involved in these situations doing a soil test, that anything such as processing facilities, meat, cheese. I just had one that came in, I believe they're washing vegetables, wash water off vegetables, or a bakery or something like that. If you're producing food, that's a non-domestic wastewater, that's an industrial wastewater. So it may not even be a pouch that you'd have to talk to the DNR. So don't waste your time doing a soil test and asking us for design stuff, because that may be a DNR issue and something totally different. Vehicle service facilities, and then even line number 4, car washes, because of the oils, grease, fuel potentials. Those aren't going to be a pouts. Breweries, wineries, distilleries. Again, that's a food production or a processing facility. We don't handle that. Kennels, the grooming and washing and bathrooms we can. The runs and the animal waste themselves, that's a DNR issue. Milk house waste is a DNR issue. Commercial laundromats are a DNR issue. In some of these cases, we might be able to mix it with domestic wastewater, and then it would be a joint review. But again, if you look at any of these, ask questions ahead of time. I guess don't waste your time out on the site doing a bunch of work, because you may be going down an avenue that's not going to be productive for you. So, industrial commercial wastewater, if it's domestic sanitary, we have it. If it's industrial commercial, DNR has it. If you're mixing the two together, then maybe it's both of us. So I just had one here. The county was asking, what do we do with a holding tank? And it was a non-domestic wastewater industrial. So we said, we don't do anything. There's no soil test. There's no permit. It's all handled through the DNR, even though it's a tank that looks just like our tank. It's a DNR issue, not ours. And then I want to bring up variances. What if you can't meet the codes or conditions? You can always file a variance. The trick with our variances, or I guess not really a trick, but the key to it is that we have to show equivalency to the code. So if you say, hey, I got no place to go, I have to put my drain field closer to my building, I want a variance. We're like, well, that's nice, but how are you going to meet the equivalency? And they say, well, what's the equivalency? Well, we don't want you digging a tank hole to drop a septic tank in right next to your building foundation. You're going to undermine the building. Or if you got an existing tank and you're building a new deck, we don't want you to be putting a footing or foundation, and we've seen these right on top of the tank lid or something like that. We don't want you impacting that tank. So if you can't meet your separation distance or something along the lines, or whatever you're trying to get a variance to, you need to show some kind of equivalence at how you're going to meet the intent of the code and protect all the components out there. It can't be a failing system. So if you say, hey, I'm building a deck and I need a lower separation distance because I can't do it, but your system's not legal or failing, we're not going to allow that to continue. You're going to have to fix it. and then a county doesn't necessarily need to sign, but we need to have, or it's best to have some kind of county acknowledgement or statement on it. If the county doesn't agree with it or has issues, that should be part of the application. And those actually come from the owner, the application for it. But I guess our, failure prevention, as long as we're doing proper design, maintenance, inspection, and use, and then again from the whole treatment that we're talking about, I know this is a grand overview of all the POUTs, not just soil testing, but it starts with the soil tester, starts with you going out there, evaluating the soil, determining where it has to go and what needs to be done, and you need to have some idea of how everything fits together to make sure that you're testing in the right spot and doing the right job to start. Because if the CST doesn't do due diligence and understanding, is this industrial, is this hazardous, is I high strength, where do I have to go, what's all being involved, do I have to get the DNR involved, you have to know what you're doing out there to know that we're testing the right area or that we're even on the right track to start with. Otherwise, the other option is you can always just move to town and then you can get a sewer bill and don't worry about it. So that's the other avenue. And then the little thing too is, again, maintenance on the end is make sure that, we're maintaining it, but that's more in the homeowner on the end, but that's how it all goes together. But again, soil and site evaluation handbook, everything that we're going to end up talking about over the next, tomorrow and, later today, tomorrow, and next week. Also on site evaluation handbook, download it off our website for free. Otherwise, you can go to Doc Sales, but you should have the electronic copy in here now if you want to print it out. Other reference materials, I think these links are still valid if you want them. Otherwise, you just search for USDA Soil Survey Manual. I believe they've got online versions now. Where it used to be, it had to buy these books, and they weren't that cheap, but you can get digital copies now for them. And a field book for describing and sampling soils. I think I'm woefully out of date. This is September 2012. I think they're up to version probably like 5 or 6 by now, but some good information in here. And this one too, I wanted to mention redoxymorphic features for identifying aquatic conditions. It's out of print, but I think you can get it. I think this link will take you to a downloadable electronic version. A lot of great pictures describing redox features and aquatic or wet conditions, and we'll talk more about that, as we go on. But very good reference. This was done out of North Carolina by the guy Papraskas. I believe, somewhat butchering his name. I know I'm butchering his name, but he is like the guy on that. And then our website here with who's working for us, and get that off our DSPS website. But anyway, that I know you may be sitting there saying, well, boy, that wasn't a whole lot of soil stuff. That was more other things. But again, that's sort of the background about what we do, why we do it. It ties everything sort of together. It gives you some of the background before we get into the nitty gritties of the soil itself. But anyway, any questions out there? I know it's sort of a little bit different here. You sit behind your computer screen, but again, if you have questions, feel free to jump in here. Let me know. Otherwise, we'll probably take another 5-minute quick break here till about 5 after, and then we'll start where the real fun goes. Is we'll start getting into soil formation. So now we're really going to start delving into soil concepts and dealing with that. So we spent the last 2 hours talking about a lot of background stuff, and I know many of you may say, sort of how's this relate in, or yeah, it's something, but it's really not soil testing. Again, it's sort of um, the drudge work is, before we get to the fun stuff of real soil science, we have to sort of know how it fits in. Why are we learning about soils? Why are we doing a soil test? Why are we doing these things? And we have to sort of know, how does the biology work? How does the wastewater treatment work? What are the codes out there? Why are we doing what we're doing? So now that you've got that background information sort of tucked away, now we're going to look at sort of the real meat and potatoes, the real soil end of it. So the first session we're going to talk about is soil formation. Fancy name for that is pedogenesis. Pedogenesis is the pedological. It has to deal with the soil pedons, and the genesis is the formation of that. So it's basically that's the name of it, soil formation, or how did it get here? And so we're going to talk about that. What exactly is the definition of soil, and how is it here? So so what is soil made from? Well, when we look at it, you go outside in your yard, maybe not this time of year, but in the summer when you can grab some, what is exactly is soil? And roughly it's about half material of some kind of usually mineral or maybe some organic matter or roots or organisms or something like that, but it's some kind of matter, of solid matter. And then the rest is an open pore space. Now, of that, some of it is taken up by water, some of it's taken up by air, and we usually say half is a solid fraction, and then the rest is a pore of which you'll have air and water in it. And that can vary depending on how wet the soil is. And we'll look sort of on that. But it's it's basically we call it, or what they call it is a three-phase system. So you got, air, which is gas, you got water, which is liquid, and you got your solid particles there, or the other phase of matter. So we have five soil forming factors. The first one is the type of parent material. Then we have climate. Then we have biota, which would be plants and animals. Then we have topography. And then last we have time. So, in order for soil to form, and we'll look at more of each of these in detail, that the type of parent material, the climate, what plants and animals are there, what topography or slope that it's on, and how long it's had to react are all going to make up our soil. So, if we don't have, well, we'll have one of those, but if we have a different one, so we can have the same parent material, same climate, same biota, same topography, but if one was recently deposited, 10 years ago, and another one is deposited 10,000 years ago, obviously that soil is going to look different. So if we change any one of those factors, we can have the same parent material and, well, probably not the same plants and animals, but if we have a different climate, same topography, same amount of time, obviously that soil is going to look different if it's in northern Wisconsin or if it's in southern Alabama. Things are going to look a little bit different. So, so parent material, we can have a couple different ones. We can have a bedrock and different kinds of rock, igneous rock, sedimentary, metamorphic. We can have a transported material that comes in. Alluvium or alluvial is a water deposition. Colluvium is moved downslope by gravity. Or we could have an organic material, could be our parent material. And so we're going to break out each one of those and look at them. So different rock types. Igneous rocks formed from the cooling of hot magma. I had mentioned before that we had things such as like the rotten granite here. That is an igneous rock, and that's going to impart certain characteristics on our soil that's derived from that. But then different kinds of igneous rocks. We can have basalt. That's a very fine grained igneous rock. That's going to give a different soil characteristic than a granite will. Sedimentary rocks like sandstones. Sandstones, we're going to have probably a sandy soil, but we can also have limestone. That's not going to be sandy. The soil's derived from them, even though they're both sedimentary. And then things like metamorphic rocks, those would be basically an igneous or a sedimentary that's been altered by rock. The rocks have been pushed back underground, heat or pressure, and they've been transformed into something else. So those kind of things are going to, different kinds of materials. Again, here, the granite or basalt. You can just see looking at the granite doesn't look like the basalt. We're going to have different kinds of, of soils that are going to come out from those. Here we talked about sedimentary rocks. You can have everything from like a sandstone, going to be obviously a sandy soil, limestone or shale, we're going to be more of a fine textured. You can tell just by the strata or the composition of the stones, what you might have. Metamorphic, we got a wide range because a nice up in the upper left, that is basically metamorphosed granite. So when it breaks down, it's going to be somewhat similar to that. We have an upper right quartzite, which is sandstone that's been re-cemented. So soils that come from that are going to look different than the sandstone before it was metamorphosed. And the same thing with shale. It goes from shale to slate on the upper middle. That's going to look different than and possibly the shale that we had to start with. So again, depending on type of parent material that we have here, Um, and so, oh, look at that. I did that. So, gneiss is granite, slate is shale, quartzite sandstone, more shale down here could be a schist, marble is limestone, quartzite is slate. Did you do these, Katie? Did you sneak these in here on me?
Yeah, I did last year.
Oh, see, this is Katie's update. She sneaks stuff in here and I forget about it. So, but that's all right. Good representation. So, again, your parent material where stuff comes from is very important. I make the analogy of if you're at a zoo and you have a mama zebra and a daddy zebra, those are the parents. What are you going to expect? You're going to expect a zebra. Well, the same thing here. If you have a sandstone bedrock, you can expect a certain type of soil, a sandy type of soil from that. If you have something like a slate or shale or limestone or dolostone, you're going to expect a finer textured soil from those. So it's important to know the parent materials where things come from because it's going to impact your characteristics of your soil greatly. So the next thing I want to talk about is weathering. So you know, well, weathering is rocks break down. You got big rocks, make small rocks. So you can have physical, chemical weathering, physical breaking apart. We see that now this time of year, freeze thawing. You get a crack in the pavement, the water goes in. When it melts, it freezes up overnight and you'll feel the bumps as you drive down the road, the frost heaves. That's physically pushing that crack apart or expanding it. Why do we have cracks? Why do we have potholes? That is a form of physical weathering. So just like your pavement, whether it's concrete or asphalt, gets cracked apart, that's what happens with rocks. Is you'll see the physical cracking or pushing apart of those. And then you can also have some erosion that's as physical. So if you have, rocks in a stream that are knocking against each other, that physical, beating against them by water, wind, or ice or other rocks, you're getting a physical erosion, physical weathering or breakdown. And then you can also get chemical weathering. That would be things, water itself, universal solvent. You look in the lower picture there, caves. You get, some weak acids from rain, and dissolves basically the limestone, and you can have a cavern form, and that's how the stalactites happen. Is that stuff is coming back out of precipitation. So you can have that. You can have decaying vegetation in water. So in the left picture, that tree, you can see a big crack. I'm sure water gets in there and freezes and swells and pushes that crack apart. But also you have, some decaying vegetation in there. Some of the acids surrounding that plant, organic acids are helping. That tree is chemically dissolving some of that rock also. So it depends on what kind of rock you have. Like down the lower one, a limestone rock, probably some pretty easy dissolution as opposed to an igneous rock or something like that. Granite is going to weather a lot harder. So we see that, even on that left picture there, the Grand Canyon, why are some faces or some bands of rocks steeper than others? Well, the steeper ones are more resistant to weathering, and the ones that have more of a slope are more weather prone, and so those weather more, and you'll see a more shallower slope to them because they're eroding out very easily. So we can have water that can also, erode stuff. Again, carrying rock and soil particles downstream, bouncing off of each other, the reduced particle size. You get abrasion in the stream bed. The ocean's wave action. Why are beaches, sandy? Because whatever rocks you had there, or seashells, the constant wave action, tumbling stuff around, abrasion against each other, makes them smaller, breaks them down. River erosion and deposition. You can see the picture there, Grand Canyon, got a big groove out there. Uh, Floodplains and deltas, that's a deposition area. An alluvium, alluvial is basically material deposited by that like floodplain or a delta. So it's through a water movement where that's being deposited. And wind can pick up sand and silt particles. I noticed here this past week driving around, there's some areas that before we had the snow cover, some open fields, and wind was blowing across. I noticed that whatever that was, last Thursday, I drove towards Madison, and there was some pretty good dust being blown off some of the fields down there. But sand dunes and abrasion, we can get some sandstorms. You'll see pictures of the sandstorms out in the Sahara or something like that. But loess, Loess, that's pronounced loess, silt-sized particles. We had the Dust Bowl days in the 20s and 30s, and then also around here when we had the interglacial period between the glaciers, we had a lot of silty material, and wind would pick that up and blow that around and deposit that. So, you can get those. And then ice with the glaciers, moving and crushing, grinding materials below, whether it's an alpine or continental glacier. So, what do some of those things look like? This is, an air photo of a floodplain landform, and all those little loops and squiggles out there are basically um, where you can see where that stream is sort of in the middle of the lighter colored there, where the sun's reflecting off of that, and see some water in some of those cutoffs. But you can see how the stream, how this river has moved back and forth across this floodplain over the years and created these little, old channels that have been filled in by silt and deposits. So this is the floodplain or alluvial plain, moving water depositional. So as you can imagine, if your parent material is alluvial soils, what kind of soils do you think you're going to get? Do you think you're going to have finer textured soils? Do you think you're going to have coarser textured soils? I guess it depends where you are and how fast the water is moving, but typically, if you're right in a stream channel, it might be a little coarser. But on some of these more backwaters, or you're where it flooded, you're going to have some fine silty material, the mud flats kind of things like that. So this is a floodplain. They have organic deposits down below from organic material, and then you can see the floodplain alluvial stuff up above. And that's, you know, everything up above here is just, you can see how they're little bands or little layers back and forth. So each of these little depositional events leaves these little layers up here. So you'll also notice that when you see alluvial plains, you'll see a lot of stratification in them, in these floodplains. Here's a silty alluvium. A little bit harder to see. You don't see as much banding, but you do see one big one right there in the middle, right to the middle of the slide. So that darker banding kind of thing that you had in alluvial, probably less frequent flooding, but must have been a bigger event when it did happen. Deposited that. You see a lot of organic material in that flood event that was out there. But again, very, very good to key in on that is that you'll have a lot of horizontal banding or layers like that when you, especially if you see alluvium, and also just knowing where you are. Obviously, if you know you're in this kind of an area, you sort of got the right to expect we're going to see these kind of alluvial soils. So this is where it gets a little tricky. This is actually a lake plain. This happens to be from Indiana, but this was an old lake plain at one time, probably during the glacial periods, but it was a giant lake. And these are actually alluvial soils, lake plain soils. The lake isn't there anymore, but this was the bottom of a giant lake. And so, how do we tell these things? Well, you can see the corn stalks and you can see how big of a cut this is, but you see how it's sort of a silty, maybe a very fine sand kind of thing. But you can see still all the banding in it, all these little layers. So that sort of gives it away that's why it's alluvial. So we got a lot of banding going on there. And here's some colluvium. We mentioned this. This is stuff that instead of alluvial, which is flooding, colluvium is the way I remember it is colluvium. It starts with like the word collect. Is this is all the stuff that collects at the bottom of a slope. So you have the rocks up above that are weathered, through whatever frost action or something like that, and they break down, they start rolling down the hill, and colluvium is what collects at the bottom of the hill from whatever that parent material is up the hill. So you'll see these talus rock slopes. The biggest talus slope east of the Mississippi is Devil's Lake. So if you're familiar with that area, you go down by Devil's Lake and near the Dells, and you can see big rock slopes down there. That's colluvium. So another parent material, rock transported, again, would be by glacial deposits, and those could be ice or meltwaters. So we have what's called glacial till, even though it really doesn't happen that way. You can think of till as like a rototiller or a bulldozer. Things are sort of mixed up, you know, tumbled around. Glacial fluvial, you can think of as like flowing. So those are sand and gravel transported by meltwaters. And we'll look at a bunch of different ones. We'll spend some time on this because Wisconsin was impacted heavily by glaciers. And so a lot of our parent materials are glacial materials. And then glacial lacustrine. So fluvial can be flowing water, whether it's glacier or not. Lacustrine is lake. You think of like Fond du Lac. That's French for LAC is lake. Um, or some of the other names throughout the state here that have lac in it, like Fond du Lac. But glacial lacustrine is a lake deposited, but it's glacial lakes, so silt and clay deposited in a glacial lake environment, ice wall lakes or lake plains, and that's what that one was we saw from Indiana. Aeolian deposits, um, those are wind blown, so they could either be wind blown silt, which would be a loess, Loess, or they could be sand dunes, wind deposited fine and medium sand. Um, so, where are some of the, what was Wisconsin impacted by? So, we do have, here's some maps here. We had four major the ice ages that in the most recent glaciation. I mean, there's other ones farther back, but just like anything, the most recent one sort of obliterates a lot of the traces of whatever happened prior to that. But they had the oldest one is Nebraskan, and then we had the Kansan, and then we had Illinoisan, and then we had the last one was Wisconsin. And you can see there's a little area in the southwest part of the state that's called the driftless area, and those areas were not impacted by the glaciers, and they were, the glaciers somehow missed that. And so the nice or why you or the interesting thing is you go to the southwest part of the state, why it's so dissected, why we have such steep valleys down there. It doesn't look like the rest of the state is because when the glacier came through, you have an ice sheet a mile thick, and it sort of bulldozes, obliterates, and deposits stuff in all the valleys. It sort of smooths out the landscape. And in that driftless area, southwest part of the state, it did not have a chance to do that. And so it's more eroded because it hasn't been impacted by the glaciers. So you can see sort of the extent of the ice sheets and what's there. And even in the driftless area, some of it extends up in the central part of the state. But even though there wasn't an ice sheet sitting on top of it, we have a lot of, it actually really it shouldn't be driftless because we have a lot of impacts from the glacier down there, the lake plains from the glacial lake Wisconsin, the sand deposits there from the edge of the glacier. So there's a lot of deposits there. But southwest part of the state, pretty much to the Mississippi border, to the Illinois border, and then just a little bit goes into Illinois, but otherwise it's pretty much Wisconsin, a little bit into Illinois. There is some across the river in Minnesota and Iowa that some people call driftless, but really, if you look at the map here, it was the Nebraskan did cover that area, but it was so long ago, it looks very similar to the Wisconsin driftless area because it's basically been unglaciated for such an amount of time that it's weathered pretty heavily over there too, or dissected pretty heavily. So here's another map showing glacial geology of Wisconsin. We have moraines, which would be till. You can have an end moraine, which is the furthest extent of a glacier, or ground moraine, which would basically be the till underneath the base of the ice sheet. So the interesting thing you can see here, can you see my pointer move when I do this, Katie,
Yep,
or not?
yep.
Okay, so you can see this black outline here, and you can see how it traces like this lobe here. This is actually the Green Bay lobe of an ice sheet. And so why is Green Bay here and on to Lake Winnebago and the Horicon Marsh? That's sort of the center of this lobe of ice that came down here and pushed its way into the state. In here, you can see the edges of these end moraines, which is the edge of an ice sheet, which is the Lake Michigan lobe that came down that formed Lake Michigan. Then you have some other smaller ones up here, like the Chippewa lobe, and I forget what some of these other ones are, but you can see these other moraines here of where the ice sheet came down. But this is the extent of the ice sheet. This is filled with sand. Then these are some more sand deposits and stuff from the glaciers as they were melting. And then here fills in some of the valleys. But this is the driftless area down here where basically there is no no deposits from the glaciers. So moraines are the dark ones. We have outwash, which would be like this material here. So as the glaciers are melting, this is the runoff from them. Some lake basins in here. You can see these hash marks. This is the big glacial lake down here. We had glacial lake up in here. Um, so those are basically big lakes at one time. And then we have the driftless area down here where there's no drift on top of it. So what did this look like? Here we have the glacial ice sheet coming here. Some of these would be, they estimate, up to a mile thick, and we can have different things that will appear underneath it. So if we have like a river run off a braided stream or something, this is where outwash plain is, where we have meltwater. The end moraines, the glacier was here at one time. The glacier is always a moving conveyor belt, and as material comes to the front, it melts out and gets deposited. So the furthest extent the glacier came up to here and deposited sort of this ridge, because this is where material was basically eroding out or eroding out of the melting glacier. So the glacier, maybe it had an event where it was colder for a decade or two and it moved forward. It sat here for a while. Now it moved back and now it's sort of sitting at this spot. And you'll see these recessional moraines as things go back. And you'll see them sort of here, that this is the furthest extent. And then it left these little lines as it sort of went back, came forward, retreated, came forward, retreated, came back and forth like that. And you'll also see a ground moraine. So this would be material underneath the glacier that it's depositing underneath. And then you can have these little things, like if you have a stream like this that's underneath the glacier, it's depositing material and it leaves this snake called esker kind of thing. You could have a piece of ice embedded in the soil or in the outwash or the till, and when it melts, it'll leave a kettle or a hole, and it fills with water. And then you can so if you have these little kettles or kettle lakes that you'll still see nowadays, and you have these end moraines, and if you have a lot of them together, you make a state park and you call it Kettle Moraine State Park. And that's why it's called that, because it has a bunch of kettles and it has a bunch of moraines. If you look around other areas, eskers, not many of those survive because those are really gravelly or sandy and they're above ground. So it's like a ready-made stockpile of sand and gravel. So when the farmers first came through and they found those and they were, building a, barn foundation or their house, and they needed some sand and gravel to mix in for whatever foundation or to mix their cement, they were pretty easily mined out. A came is sort of like an internal hole and stuff gets deposited internally. So it's sort of a pyramidal kind of shape or cone shape, sort of the opposite of a kettle. It's just a vertical deposit. And drumlins are some areas where there was some till, and as the glacier moved, it sort of elongated these along the direction of the flow of the glacier. One of the biggest drumlin fields around is in Dodge County. If you look at a Dodge County map, you'll see all the roads go northeast to southwest. And why do all the in Dodge County here? Why do they go this direction? Because the Green Bay lobe came this way and made all the drumlins face this way, and all the roads now go this way because they have to go around all the drumlins. So, sort of interesting that you can see a lot of them down that area. But why do we talk so much about glacial geology in Wisconsin? What percentage of Wisconsin was affected by glacial geology? Except for this, you know, all of it. So whatever, 90% of the state was affected by glacial geology. And even in the driftless area, we still have some glacial geology down here through some loess, so through some windblown silt and stuff in some areas. But this is some pictures of what they look like. These are recent active glaciers. You can see the glacier here in the background on the upper left picture. But this is an outwash plain. This is pitted outwash because here we have the kettles. A block of ice maybe broke off and sat here, insulated by all the sand and gravel. When it eventually melts, it leaves this hole or the kettle. Here you can see what an esker looks like. You can see the sand gravel sort of snake deposit. So this was a running stream underneath the glacier, and as it ran underneath the glacier, it deposits this. But then when the glacier leaves, it leaves an above ground, vertical sort of snake-like deposit. Came is sort of a little round hill kind of thing, and then we can have all the things that we'd have with a modern river, stream terraces or banks, or sort of alluvial kind of stuff. But so fluvial or flowing deposits, this is what outwash looks like. So here's the glacier melting, and you get all these sort of sandy, gravelly outwash deposits as apparent material. Here's another fluvial deposit. This one looks sort of a little bit backwards because you'll see how it's sort of this inverted U shape here. Again, this is a typical glacial deposit. This would be like what the inside of an esker looks like, is that as stuff gets deposited down here, underneath the glacier, you'll see these flows. But also the flowing deposits, you'll notice it's sorted, is that you'll see sort of coarser material here, then a little bit finer material, then coarser deposit here. And that depends on, the glacier might have been flowing or melting quite a bit. And we got, rockier stuff because the fine material, if it's flowing heavy, the fine material is getting deposited farther downstream. And if times are slower, either the glaciers, it's a little bit colder weather, the glacier's not melting as much, or something along those lines, then you get the finer materials that will start to settle out. Here you can see till, very big till cut. All the people walking up here to look at stuff here. So this would be like a end marine on a till, and this is just a bulldozer and everything's mixed up in it. So even though it looks stratified up here, and there are some stratifications even in till, but you'll still see, we'll look at some closer pictures, and it's hard to see here, but instead of having stuff well sorted, you'll see there's stones scattered throughout in here all over. It's not a sorted material from flowing. Till is sort of a tumbled up, mixed up. So here you can see that even though we're sort of rocky here, we have stones scattered throughout. It's not well sorted, fine material, coarse material, all mixed together. So lodgement till would be what's underneath an active ice sheet. So it's the clay-rich debris dragged along under the moving ice. Um, Lodgement till can be compacted and cemented. Because you got to think, if you're underneath the glacier and you got a mile of glacier sitting on top, it could be compacted. It could be very dense material. And then ablation is when it's actively melting. So as the ice sheets retreating, it's the till falling out or melting out of that front of that glacier. And usually that's not as compacted and more permeable. So here's sort of an idea what it looks like is that here's stuff melting off the front face. This would be an ablation till, or here's some more melt out ablation, where lodgement till is stuff that's down here that's sort of compacted by the glacier and compacted and sort of scraped along. Gets you some ideas of sort of what those look like. So here's what recessional, or ablation tills look like. These could be some more outwash kind of materials here also, depending on whether it's just melting out of the glacier and dropping right here, or if it's flowing while it's being deposited. The other interesting thing about glaciers is they don't always sort stuff nice. They don't say, okay, this is till here and this is outwash here. Sometimes we'll have areas that'll be reworked. It's sort of till and then outwash has come through and reworked it, or it's a sandier till, but it's mixed up. Again, it's not necessarily that we identify exactly what the parent material is. We know it's glacial, but identifying those characteristics, but knowing what kind of thing is might cue us in on what we're going to see and what we're going to notice there. So here's some more ablation till as it's heading back and eroding back out. Again, it's all jumbled up. We got big rocks, we got fine material. It's all mixed together. It's not like a layer of real coarse, a layer of fine. Very well noted as till because it's all mixed up. Again, what do we see here? Do we think this is an outwash or a till? It's a till. You can see that, even though we got some, finer material up here and we got some coarser and then some fine, it's still, they're all scattered throughout. This is a till. It's not an outwash. Swell and swale, we'll sometimes see these on till plain landforms. So this would be like a basal till or lodgement till where the glacier's sitting on top of this sheet, and we'll just see a weakly undulating kind of landscape. This is all till material. But when you look in the soil, you're going to see that it's all going to be mixed up. You'll have, rocks scattered throughout. But then again, the rocks will be from glaciers, so they'll be rounded because of glacial action. They won't be angular fragments coming from the bottom up, coming off of bedrock. They'll be rounded because of the glacier, but they're going to be scattered throughout the profile. Then we can also have fissile or layered till fabric. So this might be a lodgement till, where it's sitting for so long, it's actually compacted the till into sort of, you can see the rocks are still all scattered, but it's sort of flattened it out. Just sort of um, a little peculiarity of the different kinds of till, but very resistant to infiltration for water, not a great filtering medium for us because have a hard time getting water to move through that. And then we talked about loess or wind deposits here, for those that, Dust Bowl days are over. The top one, it's sort of cut off on my screen. I can't quite see it, but the top one here, I believe that was like Arizona, and then the bottom one was Johannesburg, South Africa, 2017. So, I mean, recent, we're talking within the last decade or so, both of these. Really impressive seeing what windblown sand and silt looks like. It darkens the sky and blacks things out. So it still happens, it can still occur. And then this picture here shows some of the loess, the windblown silt, and what its extents are throughout the Midwest. So, got to remember the glacial ice sheet was sitting up here, came down to this area. So, the wind's not blowing loess on top of the ice sheet, it's blowing out in front. And these are the deposits, and they have some really deep deposits out in certain areas. I think some of these deposits are up to like 100, 200 foot thick. Wisconsin, I think most of us that we have here is I've heard some places say they've found up to 6, but I've seen other studies that they say most of it is a few inches up to maybe 18, give or take. But I heard there are some places I think like down here where there may be some deeper deposits. Aeolian sand, windblown sand. You think Wisconsin we don't have it? Well, Lake Michigan shoreline, Lake Superior shoreline, we do. We have windblown sand dunes. They're out there. So to give you sort of an idea of the textural triangle, and we'll talk more about this. If you're not familiar with textural triangle, you will be by the time we're done. But sand, silt, and clay sort of gives you ideas. The clay fraction, silt fraction, what kind of where glacial fluvial sands come in to where glacial till is, gives you sort of an idea. Lacustrine sediments are typically in these textures. Loess is like the real silty, windblown stuff. Gives you sort of an idea of where these parent materials come from and where they fit on the textural triangle. Because obviously you're not going to have windblown sand if it's clay. It could be something else. Want to talk about profile development. So climate's effect on soil formation. So we talked a lot about parent materials. Very important again because it doesn't matter what you do to a soil. If the parent material says it's going to be this, you're going to have a hard time making a sandstone soil into something clay, if it's got a sandstone parent material. So parent material affects quite a bit, but other things like this will do it. Climate and soil formation. Obviously, if we have a very arid, dry, we're not going to have much for development. If we have something that's wetter, we're going to have a different kind of development on it. So here's a little bit about Wisconsin. The tension zone or transition zone is between the northern forest soils and the southern deciduous soils. And so it gives you an idea of that this is a transition zone for not only biology, but also climate. And that's going to change. Obviously, soils that form up here are going to be different than soils that are going to form down here. So again, these are some older terms, but we're going to have our more spodosols up north. We're going to have more of our alpha sols and prairie soils, mollisols down in the bottom, and then we have our big transitional zone in here in the middle. So biota's effect on soil formation, obviously, if we have soil that has the prairie soils, a lot of deep-rooted grasses, we're going to have different soil formation there than we are on a forested soil, mostly because these plants thrive and die and are adding and returning a lot of organic matter into the soil. You're going to have a lot of deep organic matter. Now, if you look at a site and you say, look, how much grass do we have here? Look how much biology is right here. I know you can't see it, but these are the stumps of trees. And you say, well, look how much organic matter I have here. And then you look at a forest and you go, well, geez, shouldn't I have a lot more organic matter here? Because I got all these trees, all these leaves. Why don't I have so much organic matter in the forest soil? Well, that's because all the organic matter is in the forest. It's not in the soil. It's tied up in the trees themselves. It's tied up in the tree trunks and the leaves and everything. And yeah, the leaves fall and provide some organic matter, but those tree trunks are where most of the organic matter is tied up, where here the organic matter dies down and returns into the soil. So prairie soils will have deep organic horizons. Forest soils tend to be much thinner. But it also depends, not only on the plants, but also the animals, earthworms, digging stuff up, moving stuff around. They're going to have a biological effect. So here we talked about the grasslands. These grasses, they grow, they die. That's the series or the order is called mollisols, deep organic soils. You'll have a lot of organic matter down deep into the soil, where in deciduous forest, it's not as much because all the organic matter, again, is tied up in that trees. The biomass is above the ground, not in the ground. And then we have the boreal forest or the northern pine forests. And again, their organic matter, because they don't even shed their leaves, they're evergreens, they keep their leaves. So here we're even going to have less of organic matter. We're going to have a very thin organic soil, organic mantle on that soil. So again, the climate and the biology here is really going to affect what kind of soil we're going to have underneath the pine woods as opposed to underneath the deciduous woods as opposed to a prairie soil. And then we have topography. Or one of our other development ones here, our soil forming factors, is where a soil forms. If we have soil forming on the upland here, is going to be different than soil down below here, as different to soil down here in the floodplain. So maybe up on top here, we're going to have well-developed profile, well-developed horizons. Where down here, if this is recent alluvium, we may not have a well-developed profile. It's going to look differently. So topography is going to have an effect based on whether it's sort of an erosional landscape or if it's depositional to where it is on that topography. So even here on this hillside, you're going to have a different soil here than a different soil on the side slope to a different soil on the toe slope. Even if this is all the same soil parent material, the green parent material, depending on whether you're here, here, or here, they're going to be different soils potentially. So here's topographic factor. What's this one show you? Well, this is also influenced by man, but you have these erosional tops here, mostly from the plowing, is that they're taking the organic matter and they're plowing it down into these lower depressions. Also, these lower depressions are holding water. So topographical, you can see how much organic matter is more in, it's wetter too, but there's more organic matter down in these depressions than there is up high on the higher ends of those slopes. Even though it's micro topography here, it's not really real big slopes. You can see that there is a difference to that. And then the last one we have is time. So just like anything, if we had soil that was just deposited in a flood last year, even though we have temperature and biology and whatever to act upon it, if we've only had a year to act upon it, that soil is not going to be very well developed. As opposed to if we had a soil that was from a glacial lake 10,000 years ago, and now it's had 10,000 years to develop, it's going to be very different than what we see now. So here it sort of gets you an idea that soil is just beginning to form disintegrating rock. As it disintegrates more, more soil develops. Here now we have organic matter from plants are starting to deposit on top, and now we have well-developed A horizon, B horizon, C horizon, those kind of things. So time does affect the soil process also. As we go through time, we're going to have more development. So this sort of shows you these are some of the major soil orders, but entasol, not much to look at. It's a little bit of organic and nothing. And septisol is a little bit better. I know Katie's been going through these some of our pouch chat. So entasol is basically new, and septisol is sort of like you can sort of think as like I think the incept. I think antiseptic. It's basically a lifeless kind of thing. There's not much there. That it's a little bit of organic, a little bit. You can see a little bit of a color development, and then nothing else. There's not much going on. Altasol is sort of like our alpha sol forest soils, but these are more developed, more weathered. They've had some time, and then you get oxasols, which would be like in the tropics. These are so highly weathered, they're all the iron is all you see because all the other minerals have sort of been stripped out of them over the millennia. There's not much out there. They're highly weathered soils. So it gives you sort of an idea. And again, we'll talk later about classifications. Alpha sols and septisols, entasols. Entasols are new, and septisols are weakly developed, and then alpha sols are more developed. So that sort of gets you an idea, like on a floodplain terrace, of sort of what kind of soils we might have. So again, when we start looking at all these different things here, piece them together, we have, what are our parent materials? We have, bedrock. We have, glaciers that have worked on them. We have relief that have worked on it. We have vegetation, different types, and we have the time, whether it's very recent or middle aged or older soils that are deposited, driftless and haven't been worked on by the glaciers. And then we talked about the temperature zones in here, the northern climates, the southern climates. Well, it's interesting if you put these all together, especially looking at things like bedrock and the glacial lobes, especially, and relief, you put these all together, and what do you see? You see a certain soils down in this area, you see different soils up in this area. Then you can see how they start to fit together based on the different parent materials, different time, different vegetation, different relief, different climates. So the five soil forming factors do make a difference on the type of soil that we're going to end up with. They do it. You can see by the soil map, they do affect our soils, and they do make a difference. So, what are some of the other things that we can do? We can have additions, organic matter in the surface layer, for instance. We can have a loss, removal of carbonates from the soil or solum, removal of organic matter. We can have a transformation. When we talked our oxidation reduction or redox, or weathering in there or things like that. Translocations, we can have stuff that moves out. So here we can have organic matter for plants and animals and stuff up here. In eluviations, the way of think of eluviation, E for exit, so it's leaving this zone, and illuviation is input or in. So just like emigrants or immigrants, you know, emigrants are leaving, immigrants are coming. So eluviation is exiting, illuviation is incoming. So we can have stuff that weathered out of here and moved out of this area and then redeposited back down here, either clay, aluminum, or iron. Mineral weathering that does some things, and reduction oxidation, redox, forming some colors out here. So one of the things like a BT or clay formation sequence, this is a fairly common soil horizon. A lot of different things are going on. Root respiration gives CO2. CO2 in soil water makes weak carbonic acid. It dissolves some calcium ions and colloidal clay particles, and they get suspended in that water. They move down, and then they accumulate with each wetting cycle. So what happens here is the clay will come out of this zone up here and up in the topsoil, and will come down, and it'll move, and then it will reprecipitate out in clay. So you'll have an increase of clay, a zone in here where it'll be heavier texture. It'll be clayier soil. So here you can see even better that this lighter zone is where it's eluviated or exited, and then illuviated or inputted down here is that the clay and stuff has accumulated down here. It exited here and accumulated down here. This is like a BT horizon. So here's some other ones that you can clearly see that this zone here, this lighter color is where it's exited, and this darker color is where it's accumulated or inputted. And the same thing here, you can see where it's exited and then where it's accumulated down below. And this one, you can not only see that, but you can also see these are redox features, the iron that's accumulated in here, reduction oxidation that's taken place. And here's some other ones. This real gray ashy one. This is a northern forest soil, pine soil. Spodosol is what it's called. You got a real thin topsoil, this real ashy colored, and then you get the iron and not much clay, but mostly the iron that accumulates out, very evident. And here's that lake plain in Indiana again. You can see all the redox colors down here, these yellows and grays and oranges. Talk about those and how exactly they form, but very apparent that it's wet sometime of the year down there. If you don't believe it's wet, look here between the corn rows. You can see how wet it is, how moist it is in between those corn rows. And then here's just a quick one to sort of illustrate sort of the absurd in a small area, but illustrates how topography can really affect the soil. You see how thick this soil horizon is here. Real steep topography, the soil horizon isn't very thick. Over here, we got, it's not as steep up here. The soil horizon is much, much thicker. Sort of, again, illustrates the absurd, but again, you can really see how, it's steep here. You're not going to get much development because things are falling down the hillside. It's obviously a lot different. And then as we talked about humid, temperate climate, we're going to have, that wet, humid, we're going to have some argillic horizons stuff form where if we up more of the northern climates, sandier sites, more forest climates, we're not going to see much of an argillic or a BT horizon form. But anyway, that was the first exposure to soil formation, about how soils form, and where the parent materials come from, what kind of impact they have on our soils, and yeah, how they form. So, any questions on that?
Thank you for watching. The series will continue in part 2. If you have any questions, please contact Matt Jansen. Thank you and have a good day.